Hello guys, welcome to Wizardium. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Neville and Luna fell in love during year 5? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, Dirigible Plums and Other Serious Things. The summer had done something to Neville Longbottom. He couldn't have named it precisely. Gran certainly hadn't commented on it, and she commented on everything, usually in the same tone she used to tell him his father would have held his wand better at that age. But something had shifted in him over those long, hot months, something quiet and tectonic, like a fault line adjusting in the dark. He'd spent most of July and August in the greenhouse behind her house, hands deep in soil, talking to his Mimbulus Mimbletonia, which had grown alarmingly and now made a sound like a contented wheeze when he spoke to it, and somewhere between the repotting and the pruning and the long silences with dirt under his fingernails, he had arrived at a conclusion. He was tired of being afraid, not brave exactly, not yet, but tired, which he decided was probably how it started. The Hogwarts Express platform was its usual beautiful chaos, families everywhere, owls objecting loudly to their confinement, first years looking like they might be sick, and somewhere in the steam and the noise, the persistent ache of something wrong. Neville felt it the moment he stepped through the barrier. It was the same feeling he got in the greenhouse when a plant was suffering in a way it hadn't learned to show yet, a wrongness in the air, something holding its breath. He hauled his trunk onto the train without asking for help, which was new, and found a compartment toward the middle of the train that was blessedly empty. He got his Mimbulus Mimbletonia settled on the seat beside him, gave it a reassuring pat, and was just beginning to relax when the compartment door slid open. Harry Potter stood in the doorway, looking like someone had been using him for target practice all summer. Not physically, he was fine mostly, but around the eyes. There was something hollowed out about him, something that hadn't been there at the end of 4th year, or rather had been planted at the end of 4th year and had had 3 months to grow into something serious. Neville, Harry said, and there was relief in it which surprised Neville more than he expected. Harry, Neville moved his bag to make room. You look terrible. I've been hearing that a lot. Ron and Hermione came in behind him, and then Ginny, and the compartment filled up with the particular noise of people who had missed each other and are too British to say so directly, so instead talk loudly about everything else. Neville sat with his Mimbulus Mimbletonia and listened and felt, for the first time since last June, like he was somewhere he was supposed to be. He almost didn't notice when the compartment door slid open again. She was already in the process of sitting down when he registered her, folding herself into the seat across from him with the unhurried precision of someone who has long since stopped worrying about whether they're welcome somewhere. She had long, dirty blonde hair that moved as though it had its own opinions about direction, and eyes that were a very light, almost colorless grey, and she was wearing a necklace of what appeared to be radishes. She had a copy of the Quibbler held upside down and she was reading it with complete serenity. Neville realized he'd been staring. "Hi," he said. She looked up from her magazine with those pale eyes and regarded him the way you might regard an interesting beetle, not unkindly, just with assessment. "Hello, Neville Longbottom," she said. "That's a Mimbulus Mimbletonia." Yes, it is. Fascinating specimen, much larger than average." She tilted her head. "You've been talking to it." It wasn't a question. Neville felt heat prickle at the back of his neck. "How did you?" The growth pattern on the upper nodes. She gestured at the plant with one finger, tracing a shape in the air. Plants that are spoken to regularly show a kind of expansion in the lateral branching that doesn't occur in isolated specimens. My father wrote a piece about it. No one believed him, of course. Ron was giving the girl a look that he probably thought was subtle. Hermione, Neville noticed, was watching with the expression she wore when she wasn't sure whether she was impressed or baffled and was refusing to commit either way. Ginny seemed entirely unbothered, which made sense. She'd mentioned this girl before in passing, someone from her year. "Luna Lovegood," Ginny said by way of introduction to the compartment. "That's me," said Luna agreeably and went back to her magazine. Harry introduced himself out of politeness, and Luna said she knew who he was, and there was a brief, odd moment where Harry seemed to be deciding how to respond to that, and then Hermione steered the conversation firmly toward school supplies and the moment passed. But Neville kept watching Luna, not in a strange way, or at least he hoped not. It was more that she fascinated him the way a plant he'd never encountered before fascinated him. There was something happening under the surface of her, something running quiet and deep. She sat in her seat with that magazine held upside down and she appeared, to anyone glancing at her, to be a slightly dreamy girl reading nonsense, but her eyes tracked the room. She listened to every word of every conversation with what he was beginning to suspect was a very precise and deliberate attention. He was still thinking about this when everything went wrong. It happened somewhere around the 2nd hour of the journey. The light outside went strange, not cloud cover strange, not weather strange, but wrong in the specific way that Neville's stomach knew before his brain did. He was on his feet before he'd decided to stand, and then Harry was gasping and Ron was going pale and Hermione said Dementor in a voice that was very controlled and very scared at the same time. The temperature dropped like something falling. Luna was already moving. She had set the Quibbler aside right side up, Neville noticed, in a detached corner of his mind, and she rose from her seat in one smooth motion and pressed herself against the window away from the door, and she looked at Neville. Not at Harry, not at Hermione, at Neville. Have you mastered the Patronus charm, she asked in a conversational tone that would have been appropriate for asking about the weather. No, his wand was already in his hand, though he couldn't remember drawing it. Have you? I'm working on it. The memory I use keeps getting complicated. She paused. Do you know what Dementors fear? I what? They don't fear the Patronus because it's made of light. They fear it because it's made of certainty. They can't consume something that knows what it is. She said this like it was obvious, like it was information available to anyone who'd thought about it for 5 minutes, so it might help to be very certain of something. The cold hit them like a wall. Neville thought of his greenhouse, the smell of earth in the morning, the particular satisfaction of getting a stubborn seedling to take root, the way his hands stopped shaking when they were covered in soil. He thought of these things with the focused, desperate intention of someone reaching for something real in the dark, and he raised his wand and said clearly, Expecto Patronum. What came out was not a fully formed Patronus. It was a burst of silver light, thick and warm, formless but substantial, and it hit the door of the compartment like a wave breaking on stone. The temperature didn't exactly rise, but the crushing weight of it, the despair, the sourness, the sense that nothing had ever been good and nothing would be, pulled back by several degrees. It was enough. Harry produced a full Patronus, a stag brilliant and enormous, and it drove the Dementor back down the corridor, and then the temperature was coming back and the light was normal, and Ron made a sound that was half laugh and half gasp. Neville's hands were shaking. He sat down hard. That was very good, said Luna, sitting down across from him again with her radish necklace swaying. Most people can't manage anything at all their first time. I've tried before, in class. He looked at his wand. Nothing like that came out. What were you thinking of? He looked up. Everyone else was clustered around Harry, who had gone white and shaky, Hermione already producing chocolate from somewhere. No one was listening to Neville and Luna. My greenhouse, he said. Stupid, probably. Not at all. She regarded him with those steady, pale eyes. Certainty takes many forms. Some people need a face. Some people need a feeling. You needed a place that belongs to you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slightly battered chocolate frog, which she held out to him. Here, chocolate helps. He took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch, but almost. Thank you. You're Neville Longbottom, she said, the same way she'd said it before, with that air of someone confirming a fact they'd known for some time. Your parents were auras, very famous ones. The sentence landed in the compartment like a stone in still water. No ripples because no one else heard it, but Neville felt the impact in his sternum. Most people who knew about his parents either didn't mention it, or mentioned it with the carefully arranged face of someone being tactful, which was somehow worse. Luna said it the way she said everything, plainly, without decoration, as a fact that existed in the world and deserved to be spoken. Yes, he said, they were very brave. They are. The correction came out sharper than he intended. They're alive. Luna looked at him steadily. I know, I meant were in the past tense of the act of being brave. They were brave then, and so they are brave now, and the word doesn't go away just because time moves. She paused. I think people sometimes confuse bravery with current action, as if it expires. Neville stared at her. He had never heard anyone say anything like that about his parents, not that kindly. Not that matter-of-factly, as though it were simply true and simply worth saying. I'm Luna Lovegood, she said, apparently deciding an introduction was overdue. My mother died when I was 9. She was experimenting with a spell. It went wrong. She said this with the same even tone, not performing grief, not armoring against it, just carrying it in the open. I find it helps to talk about things plainly. People spend a lot of energy not saying things. They do, he agreed before he'd thought about it. She nodded, satisfied, and picked up the quibbler again, turned it back upside down, and began to read. Neville sat with his chocolate frog and the ghost of silver light still warm in his wand arm, and thought that he had never met anyone quite like Luna Lovegood in his life. He thought he should probably get used to that. The rest of the journey passed the way the rest of journeys pass when the significant thing has already happened, in patches of conversation and food, and the slow dimming of the light outside the windows. Ron and Harry ate a spectacular quantity of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans and maintained a running commentary on each one. Hermione read with her book held in one hand and a piece of pumpkin pasty in the other, which Neville had learned was about as relaxed as Hermione got in public. Ginny fell asleep with her head against the window. Luna read her magazine upside down for the rest of the journey. Neville watched the dark landscape go by and thought about certainty. It was late and properly dark when they reached Hogsmeade Station, and the moment they stepped onto the platform the cold hit them again, normal cold this time, Scottish autumn cold, the kind that smelled like wood smoke and coming rain, and Neville pulled his robes tighter and looked for the horseless carriages. Except they weren't horseless. He'd never noticed that before, and he almost missed it again, except that Luna had stopped walking directly to his left and was standing very still and looking at the front of the nearest carriage with an expression of such open, uncomplicated recognition that it made something tighten in his chest. You can see them, he said. She turned to him, and for just a moment, before the serenity came back, he saw something real and a little sad cross her face. This Strauss, she said. Yes, she looked back at the creature. Most people can't. Neville looked at the space where the creature must be. He could see the indentations in the ground, the way the air shifted around something solid, the movement of the harness against an invisible shape, and then looked at Luna again. "I can't," he said, and then quietly, "Not yet." Something passed between them in that sentence that he couldn't have articulated. Luna understood it, though. He could see that she understood it and that she didn't feel sorry for him, which was the most merciful thing she could have done. "Come on," she said. "The carriages move with or without us." They climbed in together. Harry was staring at the front of the carriage with the focused attention of someone seeing something terrible and real, and Hermione was explaining, quietly and quickly, about the strals and the condition of visibility, and Ron was listening with the face of someone who finds the explanation more unsettling than the mystery. Luna sat beside Neville in the carriage and looked at the back of the invisible horse with a calm that he was starting to understand was not indifference, was in fact the opposite. She felt everything he suspected. She'd just had 11 years of practice carrying it without making it everyone else's emergency. "Luna," he said low enough that only she could hear. She turned. "Yes, the thing you said on the train about bravery not expiring." He paused. "Did you mean that, or were you just saying something to make me feel better?" She looked at him with those grey eyes, and there wasn't even a flicker of hesitation. "I never say things I don't mean. It would be exhausting to keep track of." He nodded. He believed her completely. The carriages rolled up to the castle, and Neville thought that the castle had never looked quite so much like a castle before, enormous and old and badly lit, full of people trying to solve problems that had no clean solutions. The towers were dark against the sky. He could see lights in the Gryffindor and Ravenclaw towers already, warm squares of amber in the stone. The great hall was full of noise and the smell of food and the sight of 1,000 candles. The sorting happened. Neville watched the new first years with the same complicated mix of sympathy and relief he felt every year, remembering his own sorting with perfect, mortifying clarity, and then Dumbledore stood to speak, and then everything got considerably worse. Dolores Umbridge. Neville had seen her kind before. Not specifically, not the pink cardigan, not the bow in her hair, not the particular way her mouth arranged itself into a shape that implied a smile while having nothing to do with actual warmth, but the type, the way she smiled at the room like she was doing it a favor, the way she looked at Dumbledore when he introduced her, politely, tolerantly, as though he was someone she was planning to have a conversation with much later, in very different circumstances. She stood and cleared her throat with a sound like a sentence being interrupted. "Hem hem," she spoke. Neville listened to every word with the careful attention of someone reading a warning label. She talked about progress and ministry oversight and the importance of safe, controlled, theory-based learning, and with each sentence the great hall got a little quieter, the particular quiet of people understanding what they're hearing and not liking it. Beside him, he'd somehow ended up next to her at the Gryffindor table. Just for this, just tonight, Luna was watching Umbridge with the same expression she'd used on the Thestral. Quiet and complete and absolutely clear. "She's very dangerous," Luna said under the cover of the applause that followed Umbridge's speech, applause that was distinctly thin at the Gryffindor table, somewhat better at Slytherin, and puzzled and tentative everywhere else. "She works for the ministry," Neville said, though he knew this wasn't an argument. "That's why she's dangerous." Luna finally looked away from Umbridge, looked at him. "People with power and certainty are dangerous. People with power, certainty, and the law on their side are something else entirely." Neville thought about this for a moment. "What are they?" "They're the kind of thing," Luna said, "that makes quiet people decide they need to make some noise." She went back to her pumpkin juice, serene as always. Neville stared at the front of the hall where Umbridge was settling herself into her ministry-appointed seat, still wearing that terrible smile, and felt the tectonic thing move in him again, that slow subterranean shift, and understood that this year was going to require something from him that he wasn't sure he had yet. He suspected, in some nascent, not quite conscious way, that Luna Lovegood was somehow involved in his finding it. Dinner ended and the houses dispersed, the noise of 1,000 students filling the corridors and stairwells. Neville said goodnight to Harry and Ron and Hermione and Ginny at the grand staircase, the natural point of separation between Gryffindor and Ravenclaw towers. He was halfway up the stairs before he stopped and turned. Luna was still at the base of the staircase looking up at him. She had her bag over one shoulder and her quibbler tucked under her arm, and she looked, for just a second in the torchlight before anyone else could see it, like someone very young and very alone in a very large building. "Luna," he said. She waited. "I'll see you at breakfast." She tilted her head slightly, assessing. Then something shifted in her expression, something warming in those grey eyes. Not a smile, not exactly, but the precursor to one, the thing that a smile is made of. "Probably," she said, "unless the Nargles are particularly troublesome." He opened his mouth, closed it, decided he didn't need to understand that to respond to it. "Right," he said. "In that case, good night." "Good night, Neville Longbottom," she said, and turned and walked away toward the moving staircase to Ravenclaw Tower, her hair moving with its own independent opinions, her radish necklace catching the torchlight. Neville stood on the stairs for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then continued up to Gryffindor Tower. In the dormitory, the others were already in various states of preparation for bed. Ron was telling Dean Thomas something about the canons that Dean was clearly tolerating out of social courtesy, and Seamus had somehow gotten into a debate with his own herbology textbook, and Harry was sitting on the edge of his bed staring at nothing with that new, haunted expression, the one that needed time and probably couldn't be helped with words. Neville changed in silence, got into bed, pulled the curtains. He lay in the dark and thought about the silver light that had come out of his wand on the train, formless and warm and more substantial than anything he'd managed before, and he thought about what Luna had said, that it was certainty that drove the Dementors back, certainty about something real. He thought about the fact that in 4 years at Hogwarts, he had produced exactly one Patronus-adjacent event, and it had happened in a train compartment next to a girl with a radish necklace who had looked at him like he was an interesting plant she hadn't catalogued yet. He thought about that for a long time. Then he thought about her sitting alone at the base of the staircase, looking up. Then he fell asleep and dreamed about his greenhouse, and for once the dream didn't have his parents in it, which was either progress or its own kind of loss, and by morning he couldn't decide which. The greenhouse behind Gran's house came to him in the specific sensory detail that only real places can manufacture, the weight of the humid air, the particular green smell, the way the light came through the glass in long slanted lines and turned everything golden and strange. In the dream he was repotting something. He couldn't see what it was, and someone was sitting on the wooden stool in the corner, reading. He didn't see her face, he didn't need to. He woke up to September light coming through the dormitory windows and Ron snoring with impressive commitment 2 beds over, and he lay there for a moment with the dream still warm at the edges of his thinking and made a decision. He was going to stop apologizing for existing, starting today. He dressed quickly, grabbed his bag and went down to breakfast 45 minutes before most people were ready to face the morning. The great hall was quiet, a dozen 7th years, a scattering of early-rising 1st years, 3 Ravenclaws with their faces buried in books. The enchanted ceiling showed a grey, undecided sky. He was halfway through his eggs when he looked up and found Luna already seated, 3 places down from him on the Ravenclaw side, eating toast and reading the Quibbler. Right side up this time, he caught her eye. She looked at him, then at the empty seat across from her, then back at him. He picked up his plate and moved. She watched him do it without expression, and he sat down across from her at the wrong house's table, which he'd never done before, not once in 4 years, and she put her Quibbler down between them like setting a bookmark and said, "I had a theory about you. Already. I had it last night. Do you want to hear it?" He had a feeling he was going to hear it regardless. "Go ahead. I think you've decided to change something." She said it with the same directness she'd used about his parents, about the Thestrals, about Umbridge. "I noticed it on the train, but I wasn't certain until just now. You sat at the wrong table. Ravenclaw doesn't mind, do they? They don't notice. They're all reading." She gestured at the scattered Ravenclaws who were all in fact reading. "What are you changing?" Considered the question seriously because she'd asked it seriously. "I'm not sure yet, but something." She nodded, and there was a quality to the nod that said she found this answer sufficient. She picked up her Quibbler again. "My father says that the most dangerous kind of change is the kind that doesn't announce itself, it just arrives." "Is that in the Quibbler?" "No, he said it to me when I was 7 after my mother died. He meant it about grief, but I think it applies to most things." She turned a page. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about my greenhouse." She did not look up from her magazine, but something in her went attentive. "A good dream," he thought about it. "A quiet one, the good kind of quiet." "Those are the best ones," she said, simply and completely, and that was that, and they ate breakfast in a silence that was somehow the most comfortable Neville had felt in recent memory. And the great hall filled up around them, and the enchanted ceiling resolved its opinion into a fine, light Scottish rain, and the year, the real year, under all its noise and fear and ministry interference, had begun. He didn't notice, when he walked back to the Gryffindor table to collect his bag, that Dean Thomas was giving him a very specific kind of look, the look of someone who has seen something and filed it away. He didn't notice it. He was thinking about how to get permission to cross-pollinate 2 species in the Hogwarts greenhouse before Professor Sprout had even assigned that particular unit, and how to ask without making it sound like he was showing off, because he wasn't showing off. He just genuinely knew what they do when combined, and it was extraordinary, and he needed to try it. Outside, the rain against the castle windows was steady and light. First class of the year, defense against the dark arts. He squared his shoulders, picked up his bag, and went. He had a feeling he was going to need to be ready. Chapter 2, The Weight of a Wand, Defense Against the Dark Arts, First Class of the Year, and Dolores Umbridge had arranged the desks in perfect rows. Neville noticed this before he noticed anything else, the way the room had been geometrically reorganized, all the working space of Moody's year and Lupin's year stripped away, replaced with the kind of seating arrangement that said this is a place for receiving information, not producing it. The blackboard was clean, the surfaces were uncluttered. On the front wall, in a frame that had clearly been hung that morning because the nail was still raw in the stone, was an official ministry notice in dense formal type. He took a seat in the middle row, not the back. The back was for people who wanted to disappear, and he was working on not disappearing, and waited. Umbridge came in wearing pink. There is no good way to overstate how sinister pink can become in the right context. It was a shade that belonged on birthday cake decorations and children's stationery, and she wore it like armor, which perhaps it was. She set her things down at the front with the precise movements of someone who has organized spaces before and intends to keep this one organized. She smiled at the class. The smile arrived on her face without warming her eyes in the slightest. "Good morning," she said. A ragged return from 30 students who hadn't had enough sleep and weren't sure what was happening yet. "Good morning," she said again with gentle reproach. The class said it again more uniformly. Hermione's jaw had gone tight. Harry was already vibrating with something Neville could only describe as controlled fury, which was new last year. Harry's fury had been less controlled, more explosion. This was different. This was someone who had decided to stay calm and was doing it through sheer teeth-gritting effort. Umbridge opened a textbook, Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbert Slinkard. Neville had read the back cover on the train and found it deeply unpromising. It was the kind of book that spent 4 pages explaining why a thing existed before it described the thing itself. "Today," said Umbridge, "we will be reading Chapter 1. She looked up at the class, quietly and individually. Hermione's hand was up before Umbridge had finished the sentence. "Yes, Professor Umbridge, the syllabus we were given at the end of last year indicated that 5th years would be covering counter-jinxes and defensive spellwork in practical application this year. The previous syllabus," said Umbridge, and her voice had the sweet, heavy quality of something that has been oversugared, "has been superseded by the Ministry's updated curriculum. Chapter 1, please." Neville opened his book. He stared at the first paragraph of Chapter 1, which was called Theoretical Approaches to the Concept of Defensive Response, and which began with a sentence of such magnificent redundancy that he had to read it twice to confirm it wasn't a joke. He read it a third time. It was not a joke. Around him, the class settled into the particular unhappy quiet of students doing something pointless and knowing it. Harry was gripping his quill with enough force to leave impressions. Ron's face had gone through irritation and arrived at something grimmer. Hermione was reading with the concentrated expression of someone mining for something usable and finding very little. Neville read. He took notes because his notes were always thorough, had always been thorough, because writing things down had been his way of compensating for the years when his hands wouldn't cooperate with his wand. His notes from this class, he suspected, would be thorough records of absolutely nothing actionable. When Hermione raised her hand again, this time to ask whether they'd be covering any practical spellwork at all before the owl, and Umbridge said pleasantly and finally, "No, absolutely not, because there's no need for students to be casting spells in a classroom setting," the temperature of the room changed. Not literally, not Dementor cold, but the mood, the collective temperature that dropped sharply. Harry said what everyone was thinking, and Neville watched him do it with something close to admiration, because it was the most dangerous thing you could do with Umbridge in the room, which was to state a plain truth she didn't want acknowledged. And then Umbridge gave Harry a detention, and the room went very quiet in the way that means this is not a classroom, it's a jurisdiction. Neville wrote in his notes at the bottom of his page in small letters, "Practical application, find another way." He underlined it once. The word came from Hermione first, which was fitting since most good ideas that year would come from Hermione first. She mentioned it to Harry on a Thursday 2 weeks into term, and by the following weekend it had become a plan, which became a pub meeting in Hogsmeade on the first trip, which was where Neville found himself seated in a booth at the Hog's Head with a butterbeer he hadn't touched and 20-something of his classmates and Hermione talking. The point, Hermione was saying with the focused energy of someone who has rehearsed this argument in private and is now delivering the clean version, is that Umbridge is not going to teach us anything real. The owls are in June. The Ministry can control what happens in this classroom, but they can't control what we learn. We just have to learn it somewhere else. "Who teaches it?" asked Angelina Johnson. All eyes went to Harry. Neville watched Harry sit with the weight of 20 pairs of eyes and not crumble under it. That was new too, or newly visible. Harry had always been capable of this, had been doing extraordinary things since he was 11, but there was something different about watching him accept the responsibility consciously rather than stumbling into it. "I'll teach it," Harry said. "What I know, which isn't everything, but it's something." There were questions, logistics, the ordinary back and forth of 20 people trying to agree on something. Neville sat at the edge of the booth and listened and said nothing until Cho Chang asked about a meeting place, and the conversation went circular, and Neville found himself thinking about Hogwarts' lesser-used spaces with the same focused practicality he applied to greenhouse arrangement. He didn't suggest the room of requirement that came later from other angles. But he was already thinking in those terms, already applying the problem to his knowledge of the castle's geography, because that was the kind of thinking he did when he wasn't busy apologizing for existing. He signed the parchment. He signed it clearly, his name in full, the letters even and unhurried, and that felt like something too. The DA's first meeting was a Tuesday in October, and the room of requirement was bigger than it had any right to be. Neville stepped inside and stopped for a moment just inside the door, taking it in, the high ceiling, the practice dummies, the bookshelves, the space, all the space, which felt like a promise after Umbridge's precisely arranged rows. "Brilliant," he said under his breath to no one, said Luna, appearing at his elbow from absolutely nowhere. "It smells like concentrated intention." He turned. She was there in her Ravenclaw robes, carrying a wand that was, it took him a moment, made of a slightly unusual wood, pale and smooth, with a quality to it that he couldn't name. She was looking around the room with the same calm assessment she applied to most things. "How did you get in?" he said. "The password. Ginny told me. I hope that's all right." She paused. "If it isn't, I can leave." "It's no, stay." He said it without thinking and then was entirely unsurprised to find he'd meant it. "Of course, stay." She looked at him, the ghost of that almost smile. "Thank you, Neville Longbottom." "You can drop the Longbottom," he said. She considered this. "All right, thank you, Neville." She tested it, seemed to find it acceptable. "The room is extraordinary. Do you think it knows what we're here for?" "I think that's exactly what it knows," he said. Harry started the session with Expelliarmus, which was, in retrospect, exactly the right place to start. Not flashy, not ambitious. The spell most people thought they knew and had gotten sloppy with. He demonstrated it cleanly and had people pair up, and the room filled with the sound of spells and laughter and the occasional crash of someone's partner hitting a practice mat. Neville paired with Hermione for the first round, she offered, and he accepted, because Hermione was exacting and honest, and practicing with her was always productive even when it was humbling. He got the motion right on the second try and the power right on the fifth, and by the end of the round he was disarming her with a consistency that made her blink. "You're better at this than last year," she said, retrieving her wand from the floor. "I practiced over the summer." She looked at him the way she looked at things she was revising her assessment of. "Really? Don't sound surprised." "I'm not surprised, I'm recalibrating." She handed him back the spell. Again. After 20 minutes they switched, and Neville found himself facing Seamus, who had the enthusiastic approach of someone who had decided that more force was the solution to every technical problem. Neville blocked his first 3 attempts with a Protego he'd been working on since July, which was increasingly solid, and Seamus blinked. "Blimey," said Seamus. "Your grip's too tight," Neville told him. "You're strangling the spell before it gets out." He demonstrated the release motion. "Like this, wrist, not elbow." Seamus tried it. It worked better. He blinked again. "You practiced?" "Yes," said Neville patiently. "That's what summer is for." Across the room, Luna was practicing with Ginny. Ginny was a natural, quick and light-footed wand movement, economical, power to spare, and she was going easy on Luna out of courtesy, which Neville could see from 20 feet away was the wrong call. Luna's defense was strange. She moved oddly, not dodging in the expected directions, stepping sideways instead of back, so that Ginny's Expelliarmus sailed past her rather than finding its target. She wasn't blocking, she was making herself hard to hit, which was a completely different skill and arguably a more interesting one. He watched her redirect one of Ginny's spells, not block, redirect, a very fine distinction, and the spell hit the practice dummy behind her and Ginny stopped and stared. "How did you do that?" Luna held up her wand and showed her the motion. "You apply the countering force at an angle rather than head-on. Like water around a stone rather than a wall against a river." She glanced over her shoulder, caught Neville watching and didn't look away immediately. Something passed between them, nothing named, nothing declared, just a mutual acknowledgement of having seen something in the other. He looked back at Seamus. Again. By the end of the session, Harry looked satisfied in the way he looked when he'd done something genuinely useful. Neville felt warm in the way he felt after a really good day in the greenhouse, pleasantly worked, competent, alive to the specificity of what his hands could do. Outside the room of requirement in the 7th floor corridor, people dispersed in clumps of 3 and 4, keeping it quiet because the corridors had started feeling watched. Neville walked alone until a figure fell into step beside him. "You were good in there," Luna said. "Hermione says I improved." "Hermione says everything." "But I mean, I noticed it myself." She was looking straight ahead, her hair moving in the draft from the corridor windows. "You have a different relationship to your wand than most people." "What do you mean?" "Most people hold their wand like they're trying to convince it to work. You hold it like it's already decided to." She paused. "When did that change?" He thought about it honestly. "This summer. I spent a lot of time alone, and without anyone watching me I stopped." He searched for the right word, tensing up. "Expectation of failure," she said with the directness that was becoming, he realized, one of his favorite things about her. "Other people's expectations are very loud. Your grandmother expects a particular kind of Neville, I imagine." It was not a comfortable sentence, it was also entirely accurate. She expects a Neville who lives up to his parents. You've been trying to become that specific person rather than discovering what you actually are. She said this without judgment, with only the clean, clinical accuracy of a diagnosis. That's very common, most people never realize it's happening. He stopped walking, she stopped a half step later and turned to face him. "Luna," he looked at her directly, "has anyone ever told you that you're a bit alarming?" She considered this seriously. "My father says I should come with a warning label." "He means it affectionately." She tilted her head. "Was it too much?" "No," he said. "It was exactly right. That's what makes it alarming." She smiled then, a real one, complete and unhurried, and it changed her face substantially. He filed this information away in the part of his mind that kept track of things that mattered and might matter more later. They started walking again. "What were you thinking about?" she asked. "In the DA session, when you were practicing, you had a look." "What kind of look?" "The kind that means someone is doing something with their whole attention, not performing it, doing it." I was thinking about leverage, he said. Force dynamics. In herbology, really advanced herbology, you learn a lot about how to apply the right pressure at the right point rather than just using brute strength. A seedling that won't take root doesn't need to be forced. It needs the right angle. Paused where he was talking about plants during a conversation about magic. Sorry, no, she said with some urgency. That's exactly the right way to think about it. Ollivander wrote a paper about the sympathetic relationship between certain wand woods and the practitioner's dominant cognitive approach. Some people are force primary casters, some are angle primary. It might be why your Protego is so effective. You're not fighting the attacking spell, you're redirecting it. He stopped again. Stared at her. That's exactly what I'm doing. I know, I could see it. She didn't look smug about it, which he appreciated. You should tell Harry he could build the curriculum around different casting approaches rather than one standard technique. It would make the DA significantly more effective. He thought about this for the remaining distance to the Gryffindor-Ravenclaw staircase junction, and when they stopped at the natural parting point, he turned to her and said, "You could tell him yourself. You're in the DA. He listens to you," she said. "He doesn't know me well enough yet. He'll learn." She seemed to find this agreeable. "Good night, Neville. Good night, Luna." Went up to Gryffindor Tower and did his defense homework, which was a 12-inch essay on the theoretical basis for non-confrontational spellwork that was going to be deeply ironic given what they'd just been doing, and he did it at twice his normal speed because his mind was elsewhere, working on the problem of force and angle and the geometry of spellwork, and he fell asleep with his quill still in his hand. The herbology incident happened on a Wednesday in the second week of November. The day had started normally enough: grey sky, light frost, Professor Sprout in excellent spirits because her mandrakes were showing exceptional secondary growth. Fifth years had herbology twice a week, and it was the class where Neville felt the specific, clarifying ease that comes from doing the thing you are unambiguously better at than everyone else in the room. He'd been working with a species of correcting creeper, a plant used in certain restorative potions, temperamental and very particular about soil acidity, when Professor Sprout had come to check on his progress and stopped, looking at his work with an expression he'd learned to recognize as genuinely surprised. "Neville," she crouched down beside his tray. "How have you got the lateral vines to adhere at this stage? This is 3 weeks ahead of schedule." He explained the soil composition adjustment. He'd made a small but significant change in the magnesium ratio, combined with a modified watering schedule, and she listened with the full engaged attention that was her best quality as a teacher, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "This is publishable," she said. He blinked. "What? I mean it. With your permission, I'd like to document this and submit a note to the Journal of Advanced Herbology." She looked at him over her dragonhide gloves. "You've been doing this for years, Neville, and I haven't pushed you because I didn't want to, but this is genuinely exceptional work. Not exceptional for a student, exceptional." The greenhouse was suddenly very warm. I mean the ratio adjustment wasn't. It seemed obvious from the, "Don't do that," she said, not unkindly, firmly. "Don't explain it away. I know what ordinary looks like, and I know what extraordinary looks like, and I am looking at extraordinary right now." He nodded. He absorbed it. He didn't say thank you immediately. He let it land first, let it be real before he responded to it, and Professor Sprout seemed to understand this because she gave him the space for it. "Thank you," he said finally. "Yes, document it." She smiled and moved on to the next student. The problem came at the end of class. He was cleaning up and the other students were filing out, and Professor Sprout had gone ahead to the castle for her next commitment, when the greenhouse door opened and Draco Malfoy walked in. He had no reason to be there. Fifth-year Slytherins had herbology on Thursday, and he wasn't alone. Crabbe and Goyle flanked him with the dedicated purposelessness of architectural features. Neville continued cleaning up. "Longbottom," Malfoy said in the tone he used when he wanted the word itself to be the insult. "Still playing in the dirt." Neville set down his trowel. He didn't turn around immediately. He took the 3 seconds to make a decision, not an impulsive one, a deliberate one, and then he turned. "Malfoy." He kept his voice level. "The 5th-year Slytherin greenhouse session is tomorrow, you know that." Malfoy's eyes moved to the work Neville had just finished, then back. "Sprout tell you it was impressive, did she? Special little prodigy. She told me it was publishable." He said this not to boast, but because it was true and he wasn't going to minimize it. "What do you want?" Malfoy stepped closer. He had the particular confidence of someone who had been told their entire life that the space they occupied was rightfully theirs. "My father," he said, "is on the board of the Society for the Advancement of Magical Herbology. Among other things, I'd hate for any unfounded submissions to be met with institutional skepticism." For a moment Neville was quiet. The greenhouse was warm and green and smelled like earth, and around them the plants went on doing what plants do, indifferent to human politics. "Your father," Neville said, "is on the board. You want me to know that he has influence over what gets published and what doesn't." "I want you to remember your position," Malfoy said with the smile that wasn't one. "That's all." Neville looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Crabbe, then Goyle, then back to Malfoy calmly and without hurry. "Malfoy," he said, "I've been thinking a lot lately about what my position actually is and what yours is. Your father has money and influence and a very impressive collection of institutional affiliations." He picked up his bag from the bench beside him, and a dark mark on his arm. which, given that Voldemort is back, seems like it might become a problem for the Malfoy family's institutional access fairly soon. He said the name clearly. He'd been practicing, not with the self-conscious effort of someone forcing bravery, but because Luna had said it once in the carriage without flinching and he'd thought, that's right, and started doing it too. Malfoy had gone very still. I'd leave, Neville said, and he said it the way Professor Sprout had said don't do that, not unkindly, firmly. The greenhouse is occupied until 4. Malfoy left. Not immediately, there was a moment of charged stillness, Malfoy deciding whether to push it, Neville standing there with his bag over his shoulder and his hands completely steady, and then Malfoy turned and walked out, Crabbe and Goyle lumbering after him. Neville stood in the empty greenhouse for a moment, listening to the sounds of growth that were always there if you listened for them, the faint shift of roots, the breathe of leaves, the small living noises of 100 different species existing simultaneously. He had just said Voldemort to Malfoy's face, he had just not flinched, he was shaking a little, but the shaking came after. That felt important somehow, that the steadiness came first, and the shaking was just the adrenaline catching up. He left the greenhouse and walked back to the castle, and he was halfway across the courtyard when he realized Luna was sitting on a stone bench near the door reading. Not waiting for him, she wouldn't have known he'd be there just reading in the November cold with her robes wrapped around her and her hair doing what her hair did. She looked up when he approached. She read his face in the way she read everything, quickly, thoroughly, without making a production of it. Something happened, she said. Malfoy came to the greenhouse, tried to imply his father would block my work getting published. He sat down next to her on the bench. The stone was cold through his robes. I told him to leave. Did he? Eventually, he looked at his hands, still a little unsteady. I said Voldemort's name. She nodded slowly. How did that feel? Strange, good strange. He paused, like something that was clenched finally let go. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the castle wall. Fear of a name, she said, is fear of the thing itself attached to a word so that every time you say it the fear fires automatically. Naming it without fear, saying it plainly like any other word, is a kind of reclamation. She paused. My father taught me that about my mother's death. He said I could say she died whenever I wanted out loud and it wouldn't make it more true than it already was, but it would make me more honest than pretending otherwise. He turned to look at her. She was still watching the castle wall, pale in the November light, the cold putting color in her cheeks. She looked in this moment completely real, not dreamy, not strange, just present and clear and carrying something heavy with a steadiness he found extraordinary. Luna, he said, can I ask you something? You can ask me anything. How do you do it? Not the magic, just the way you move through the world like it doesn't have the ability to hurt you. She turned to look at him then, and there was no serenity in her expression, no dreamy distance. She was entirely there, entirely present, and what he saw in her face was something he hadn't expected, not composure, something behind composure. It does hurt me, she said. It hurts me a great deal. A brief pause. I just decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let it make me small. My mother was the most extraordinary person I've ever known, and she's gone, and I live at a school where people steal my things and put them back in odd places and call me names, and there are Death Eaters and the ministry is lying, and sometimes it's… She stopped, started again. Sometimes it's a lot. She looked away. But I think if I started hiding the things that make me who I am, I'd look up in 10 years and find I'd hidden myself entirely, and then there'd be no point. With that, the courtyard was empty except for them, cold and grey and quiet. Somewhere inside the castle a class bell rang distantly. I'm glad you're here, he said, not carefully, not after deliberation, just plainly because it was true. She looked at him again, and this time the almost smile became a real one, complete, uncalculated, genuine. I'm glad you're here too, she said. You're much more interesting than most people. That's the best compliment I've received in a while. It should be. She stood, gathering her book. You should know I don't give it easily. He walked her to the Ravenclaw corridor junction because it was on the way to nowhere in particular, and also because he wanted to, and when they parted she said, next DA session is Thursday. I have a theory about your Protego that I want to test. I'll be there. Good, she turned. Oh, and Neville. Yes. You should know that Malfoy telling his father about your work will probably make it more publishable, not less. Sprout has allies too, and the journal's editorial board includes 2 Muggle-borns who would love nothing more than to approve something that Lucius Malfoy tried to suppress. She paused. Just so you know. He stared at her. She gave him one final look, clear and steady, and walked away. He stood in the corridor grinning at the wall for several seconds, which was undignified and entirely fine, and then he turned and went to History of Magic, which was terrible and didn't mind it even slightly. That Thursday's DA session was the one where things came together in a way that felt not sudden, because it had been building since September, since the train, since the first real conversation, but decisive, like a plant finally breaking the surface. They were working on Reducto, Harry demonstrating the wand movement with the focused precision of someone who had used this spell in situations where getting it wrong had consequences. Neville practiced the motion slow first, feeling the geometry of it, the angle and force distribution Luna had made him think about differently. He raised his wand at the practice dummy. He thought about leverage, about the right pressure at the right point. He thought about his greenhouse and what it felt like to be certain. He cast it. The dummy exploded, not neatly, not with the controlled force the spell usually produced. The entire thing came apart, stuffing and wooden frame and canvas facing scattered across a 10-foot radius, and there was a profound silence in the room of requirement that lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the room erupted. Laughter, impressed swearing, a couple of people staring with open mouths. Harry was grinning, genuinely, broadly, the way he grinned when something surprised him. Hermione looked like she was trying not to be excited and failing. Neville stood in the middle of it, wand still raised, ears slightly red, and said to the wreckage, "I may have miscalibrated the force slightly." "Miscalibrated," Ron said, looking at the scattered debris. "Right." From across the room, Luna met his eyes over the heads of the laughing crowd. She wasn't laughing. She was watching him with that complete, careful attention, and on her face was something he was beginning to learn to read, a quiet satisfaction, the expression of someone who has seen something they expected and are pleased to have the expectation confirmed. She gave him the smallest nod. He gave her one back. Harry assigned him a new dummy, and they continued, and the session was good, genuinely, productively good, and when it was over and people were filtering out in small, quiet groups, Harry stopped Neville at the door. "That reducto," Harry said. "How?" "Angle of application," Neville said. "Force dynamics. I've been thinking about spellwork the way I think about herbology." He considered how to explain it. "When you're dealing with a plant that needs something, you don't just apply force in the obvious direction. You find the point of least resistance and apply the right pressure there. I think magic works the same way, but nobody teaches it that way." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Who told you that?" "Luna, mostly, and then I thought about it." "Luna," Harry repeated, in a specific tone that was doing something under the surface that Neville chose not to examine too closely. "She's smart," Neville said, without inflection. "Yeah," said Harry, "I'm getting that." He went back to Gryffindor Tower and sat by the fire and thought about the session, about the dummy exploding, about the silence and then the room coming alive. He thought about Malfoy in the greenhouse and the way his voice had been steady when it needed to be. He thought about Professor Sprout saying the word publishable and the way he'd let it land without explaining it away. He thought about Luna's face when the room erupted, the quiet, private satisfaction of it. He picked up his herbology notes and started working, and the fire crackled and the tower was warm, and outside the November wind was picking up against the castle walls, and somewhere in Ravenclaw Tower, presumably, Luna Lovegood was reading something upside down or right side up or sideways and thinking something true and interesting and entirely her own. He smiled at his notes. He worked until midnight. Chapter 3. Things that cannot be explained away. The greenhouses at 2 in the morning were nothing like the greenhouses during the day. During the day they were practical places, warm and purposeful, full of Professor Sprout's instruction and the organized industry of students learning what plants needed. At 2 in the morning they were something else. The glass panes held the darkness outside like water held in cupped hands, and the interior was lit only by the bioluminescence of certain nocturnal species, a pale blue from the moondew ferns, a softer amber from the dreaming pufferpods, the occasional cold green flicker of the nightshade variants Professor Sprout kept in the far corner behind a locked gate. The smells were different too, richer and stranger, the daytime green smell layered over with something darker and sweeter, the scent of plants doing their real work in the quiet. Neville sat on the floor between greenhouse 3 and 4, back against the stone base of the wall, knees pulled up, robes wrapped around himself against the November cold. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had his wand in his lap and his hands were loose around it, and he was not, in any meaningful sense, doing anything. Just sitting, just breathing. The dream had been bad tonight. Not the greenhouse dream, the good quiet one, the other one. The one that lived in the part of his memory that had accumulated detail through years of St. Mungo's visits, his mother's hands, which had once been capable of extraordinary magic and now held a gum wrapper with the specific blankness of something no longer connected to intention. His father's eyes, which sometimes tracked him across the room and sometimes didn't, and the uncertainty of which you were going to get, and the way that uncertainty never got easier no matter how many times you lived it. In the dream, they didn't recognize him. That was the version the dream preferred. He'd been sitting here for about 40 minutes. The castle was perfectly silent in the way it only got very late at night, when even the portraits were sleeping and the ghosts had retreated to wherever ghosts went in the small hours. The grounds were dark and enormous around the greenhouses, and beyond the grounds the forest was darker still, and Neville sat with his back to warm stone and breathed and tried to locate himself in his own body, which was something Madame Pomfrey had suggested once offhandedly years ago, and which actually worked. He heard the greenhouse door open. He nearly cast a spell from pure reflex, wand up, fingers tight, body bracing, and then he stopped, because the footfall was light and unhurried, and because only one person he knew moved that way in the dark, as though darkness was simply another quality of a space rather than an obstacle. Luna Lovegood appeared around the corner of the stone partition, holding a small jar that contained a light moth, the wizarding equivalent of a lamp, soft and directional, the moth beating its luminescent wings slowly against the glass. She looked down at him sitting on the floor without surprise, without alarm, without any of the performance of concern that he'd have gotten from anyone else. She looked at him the way she looked at the Thestrals. "I saw you from the Ravenclaw Tower window," she said. "I have a good view of the greenhouse path. You were awake. I often am. She lowered herself to sit beside him on the floor, cross-legged, settling the light moth jar between them where it threw both their faces into soft amber. Bad dream. The question was so simple and so direct that it bypassed every defensive reflex he had, every version of I'm fine that he'd been using since he was approximately 8 years old. Yes, he said. She nodded once. She didn't say, do you want to talk about it, which was the question that made him want to talk about it least. She just sat with him, cross-legged in the cold, her light moth casting its small warm circle against the November dark, and she was quiet. 3 minutes passed. The moondew ferns made their faint blue light. The dreaming pufferpods breathed. My parents are in St. Mungo's, Neville said. The Janus Thicky ward, long-term spell damage. A pause. I know, Luna said quietly. He looked at her. Ginny told me last year. She wasn't gossiping. I'd asked her about you specifically because I was curious, and she told me the way someone tells you something serious. She paused. I hope that's all right. I didn't ask for ammunition. I was just, she considered the word, curious. About me. About you. She said it without deflection, without embarrassment, without the self-protective hedging that usually accompanied this kind of admission. You seemed like someone worth being curious about. He sat with that for a moment. The cold was settling into his robes properly now, but it wasn't bad. It was clarifying, the way cold sometimes was. The dream, he said, the one I keep having, they don't know who I am. Luna was silent. My dad, sometimes when I visit, he watches me across the room and I can tell he's not there exactly but close to the surface. Like there's a word right at the front of his mouth that he can't quite get out. And I think I've spent most of my life thinking that if I'm good enough, brave enough, if I become enough of what they were. He stopped, looked at the light moth, that maybe it would come back, the word, the recognition. He exhaled, which is stupid. It's not stupid, Luna said. It's what people do when they love someone and can't fix what's wrong with them. They try to deserve it better. She pulled her robes. I used to think that if I was enough like my mother, if I learned the spells she'd been working on, if I understood what she was trying to do, then the loss would make more sense, as if understanding it would make it smaller. Did it? No, a pause, but the trying taught me a lot about spellwork and about her, so it wasn't useless. He looked sideways at her. The light moth moved its wings in a slow, even rhythm, and her profile in the amber light was very still. What was she like? He asked. Luna was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer, and he was about to say you don't have to when she began. She was like if someone took a hurricane and taught it to read, Luna said. She was very small and very fast, and she talked as quickly as she thought, which was very quickly, and she laughed at things other people hadn't noticed were funny yet. The words came carefully, with the quality of someone handling something precious. She called me her dirigible plum because I was round-cheeked as a baby, apparently, and because, Luna touched the radish at her throat, a habit unconscious, dirigible plums are supposed to enhance your ability to accept the extraordinary. She thought that was what she wanted most for me. The ability to accept the extraordinary, Neville said. She died trying to invent a spell that had never been done before. Something to do with memory. She thought she could create a charm that would anchor a person's memories externally, the way a pensive holds them temporarily but permanently, so that if something happened, she stopped. So that if something happened to a person's mind, they wouldn't lose access to themselves. They'd be held somewhere safe. A pause. The irony is not lost on me. The night was very quiet. Neville felt the thing she hadn't said settle into the space between them with the weight of a stone. Her mother had been trying to create the very thing that would have saved his parents, had died doing it. He didn't say this. He didn't say that's extraordinary or I'm sorry or any of the other things that were true but insufficient. He sat with her in the cold beside the light moth in the blue-green glow of the nighttime greenhouse and was present. After a while she said, what were they like before? I don't really know them, he said, not properly. I have their reputation and my Gran's stories and a few photographs. My dad was very funny, apparently. That's what Gran says, which tells you a lot because she's not someone who mentions things for no reason. He turned his wand over in his hands. My mum was the better duelist. She was one of the ones they called on first when it was really bad. She and my dad both. A pause. They were tortured into insanity by Bellatrix Lestrange. He said it plainly. The same way he'd started saying Voldemort's name, not with performance, not with the visible effort of forcing himself, just as a plain, true fact in plain language. Yes, Luna said, I know. A breath. Bellatrix Lestrange is, don't. He glanced at her. You don't need to, whatever you were going to say about her. Luna looked at him. I was going to say she's afraid, she said. People who do what she does are always afraid of something, usually themselves. She paused. That doesn't make it better. I just think it's important to understand enemies accurately. Cartoons of them are easier to dismiss and harder to defeat. He stared at her. What? She said. You, he said, or I keep looking for the right word. My father says I'm clarifying. That's exactly right. He looked back at the light moth. Clarifying. A companionable silence opened up between them, not empty but full, the kind that accumulates between people who are becoming real to each other and have stopped needing to fill every gap. The dreaming pufferpods shifted and breathed. The nightshade in the locked corner flickered green once like a thought. Neville, Luna said. Yeah, I think you should know something. She turned to face him fully. In the amber light, with the cold in her cheeks and her hair moving gently in a draft from the glass, she looked entirely, completely present. You keep talking about your parents as if the reason you're the way you are is you falling short of them. But I've been watching you since September, and what I see is someone who is already extraordinary in his own right, without any reference to Frank and Alice Longbottom. She said their names, his parents' names, the same way she said everything plainly, giving them their full weight. Your herbology, the way you think about magic, the Patronus on the train, the way you stood in front of Malfoy in the greenhouse. She paused. The way you came out here to be sad in a greenhouse at 2 in the morning instead of doing it in your dormitory because this is the place that's yours. He opened his mouth. I'm not finished, she said. He closed his mouth. I think you've spent so long trying to be a particular version of something that you haven't noticed you've already become something better. And I think the reason you haven't noticed is that the people around you, the ones who matter to you, have been too busy with their own emergencies to tell you. She looked at him steadily. So I'm telling you, because someone should. The greenhouse was very quiet. Neville felt something move in his chest, not a dramatic tectonic thing this time, but something finer, something like a key turning in a lock that had been corroded shut so long he'd forgotten the lock was there. He breathed again. Thank you, he said. The words came out rougher than intended. Don't thank me for telling the truth, she said. That's just talking. Right, a breath that was almost, not quite, the precursor to something else. He kept it. Okay. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she picked up the lightmoth jar and its occupant shifted and flared, throwing a pulse of gold across both of them, and she set it back down and said, tell me something about the plants in here, the nighttime ones. I want to know what they actually do. And so he told her. He talked about the moondew ferns and their bioluminescent mechanism, which was poorly understood, and which he had a theory about involving a symbiotic relationship with a microorganism in the soil. He talked about the dreaming pufferpods and the compound in their breath that had mild sedative properties, a fact that had been used, he suspected, in the potion that made hospital wards peaceful before modern potions had surpassed it. He talked about the nightshade variants in the locked corner and what they could do if you cultivated them correctly, which was extraordinary and slightly dangerous, which was why they were locked up. He talked the way he never talked in class, not carefully, not watching for the moment when someone's attention drifted, not bracing for the wrong answer, but freely, with the full, unguarded pleasure of someone talking about the thing they knew best to someone who was genuinely listening. Luna asked questions. Good ones, precise ones. She had more botanical knowledge than he'd expected. Her mother, she explained, had used plant compounds in several of her experimental spells, and Luna had read all her mother's notes, and at one point they disagreed actively and with energy about the correct interpretation of the pufferpod's respiratory cycle, and he argued his position and she argued hers, and he changed his mind partway through and said so. And she changed part of her position in return and said so without any awkwardness, as though changing your mind when you encountered a better argument was simply the obvious thing to do. It was 3:30 when they realized how late it was, or rather when Neville realized it and said 3:30 in slight alarm, and Luna looked at the sky through the greenhouse glass and said, time gets elastic when a conversation is good. They put the lightmoth away and walked back to the castle in the dark, using a side entrance that Neville knew from 4 years of occasional late-night escapes, not rebellious ones, just necessary ones, the escapes you need when dormitories get too loud and too close and you need 15 minutes of sky. At the corridor junction that had become their habitual parting point, the place where Gryffindor went one way and Ravenclaw went another, they stopped. Thank you, he said, for coming out. Wanted to? She said this with the simplicity that was, he was learning her particular signature. No performance, no cushioning, no strategic ambiguity. She said what she meant. Sleep well, Neville. The bad dream will come back sometimes, but less often, I think, if you make enough real things to fill the other nights with. He thought about this. Real things like what? She tilted her head. In the torchlight, her pale eyes were very clear. I have a feeling, she said, that you're working that out. Then she turned and went up toward Ravenclaw Tower, her lightmoth jar tucked under one arm, her robes trailing slightly on the stone. He stood at the junction for a moment. Then he went up to Gryffindor Tower and got into bed and pulled the curtains and lay in the dark, and he didn't dream at all, which was the best night he'd had since September. The world outside did not, of course, hold still for any of this. November turned to December with the grinding inevitability of an institution deciding to become something worse. Educational decrees appeared on the boards the way illnesses spread, first 1, then 3, then 6, each one chipping another piece away from the school's architecture of normalcy. Decree 24 banned student organizations without ministry approval. The DA moved faster, quieter, and Hermione's enchanted galleons kept them coordinated with the precise efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this kind of situation. Decree 25 gave Umbridge authority over the other teachers, which created a specific, visible discomfort in the staff, professors who had been at Hogwarts for decades suddenly navigating around a woman who had been there for 3 months and outranked them on paper. Neville watched McGonagall process this in real time during Transfiguration and concluded that the word he was looking for was formidable, and that McGonagall was approximately twice as formidable as anyone Umbridge had met before, and that this was going to be interesting. He was right. Confrontation happened in the corridor outside the Transfiguration classroom the week before winter break, which Neville witnessed entirely by accident, having come back to retrieve a Transfiguration text he'd left on his desk. He was at the classroom door, hand on the latch, when he heard Umbridge's voice from around the corner, the sweet, overmodulated tone of someone exercising power while maintaining the performance of reasonableness. "Minerva, a moment." McGonagall's voice, "Professor Umbridge. I've noticed your fifth years have been particularly energetic in their practical work lately, more so than the other houses." A pause. "I wonder whether additional preparation is happening outside the sanctioned curriculum." Neville stood very still. "My students," McGonagall said in a tone so flat and cold that it could have been used to preserve food, "are preparing for their Transfiguration owl, which requires practical application as I have taught it for 39 years. A pause, perfectly calibrated. "If the Ministry would like to interfere with Transfiguration education, I suggest they produce someone with appropriate credentials. Good afternoon, Dolores." He heard heels on stone, McGonagall's distinctive stride, and pressed himself into the classroom doorway as she passed. She didn't see him. She was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who has drawn a line and is waiting to see who crosses it. He got his book and left quickly. In the common room that evening, he told Harry and Hermione what he'd heard in a low voice over their homework, and Harry absorbed it with the focused attention he was increasingly applying to everything that related to Umbridge's movements. "She's building towards something," Hermione said. "The decrees, the monitoring, looking for what the staff are doing. She's gathering information." "For the Ministry," Harry said. "For Fudge, so he can say Dumbledore's running an illegal operation. So he has grounds to remove him." She was quiet for a moment. "Which means we need to be more careful, all of us." Neville thought about the DA, 20-some students meeting twice a week, getting significantly better at practical magic in a school where practical magic was supposedly banned. He thought about Umbridge's eyes moving around the Great Hall during meals, cataloguing, noting. "She's going to find out about the DA eventually," he said. The others looked at him. "I'm not saying stop, I'm saying we should think about what happens when she finds out, plan for it." He looked at Harry. "Who knows about the parchment, the one we all signed?" "Hermione made it." "Made it do what specifically?" Hermione explained. "The jinx she'd attached, the kind of disclosure deterrent that would make anyone who betrayed them regret it." Neville listened carefully. "That handles the members," he said. "What about access to the room itself?" "If someone follows any of us, the corridor disguises itself," Harry said. "It looks like a wall. From outside, what about the room appearing on Filch's maps, or Umbridge doing a localized revealing charm on the 7th floor? He'd been thinking about this for days, turning it over the same way he turned a plant problem, identifying the weak points in the root system, the places where the disease could enter. Hermione was looking at him with the calibrating expression again. "You've been thinking about this? Someone should." He wasn't sharp about it, just factual. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then, what do you suggest?" "Stagger the entrances. Nobody arrives at the 7th floor in a group, 5-minute intervals, different routes. I can map the approach corridors and identify which ones have monitoring potential." He paused. "And we should have an exit plan in case she finds the room while we're inside." They talked for an hour. When they were done, they had a better plan than they'd started with, and Harry looked at Neville with an expression that was something past surprise and short of something he wasn't ready to name. "Good," Harry said simply. Neville went back to his homework. The winter break came and went. Neville spent it at Gran's house in the greenhouse, talking to his Mimbulus Mimbletonia and working on the correcting creeper documentation that Professor Sprout was assembling for the journal. He owled Luna twice, once to send her a small cutting of the moondew fern, because he'd thought of something about the bioluminescent mechanism and wanted her opinion, and once to say, with the deliberate plainness he was learning from her, that he hoped her break was good. She owled back both times. The first reply was 4 pages, and engaged with the bioluminescence question with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about it for longer than the question had been asked, and he spent 2 evenings working through it and modifying his theory and writing back. The second reply was 3 sentences. "The break is quiet, and my father is making a very complicated soup that he says will protect against rackspurts. I think you are brave for asking. I hope your greenhouse is warm." Read it 3 times, brave for asking. He turned the phrase over. He'd thought asking was the easy part, but she'd called it brave, and she was someone who used words accurately, and he thought about that, about the small courage of reaching out to someone you were becoming important to, the vulnerability of indicating it at all. He wrote back, "The greenhouse is very warm. I'm glad the break is quiet. Tell your father the soup sounds extraordinary." He did not write, "I think you're brave too." But he thought it. January arrived, and with it the return to Hogwarts and the stiffening of Umbridge's regime, which had apparently used the winter break to consult with itself and come back with renewed purpose. New educational decrees, monitoring of outgoing Owl Post, the right to search student belongings. The day the Owl Post monitoring was announced, Neville went to find Luna. She was in the library at a table in the far corner by the window, books arranged around her in a pattern that appeared chaotic and was probably the opposite. She looked up when he sat down across from her, registered what his face was doing, and said, "You have something urgent. Umbridge is monitoring owls." He kept his voice low. "Which means every owl I've sent home recently is now potentially compromised," she finished. "I know, I received the same notice." She looked at him steadily. What were you writing about? The correcting creeper work, the moondew fern. A pause. Your letters. She held his gaze. My letters aren't incriminating. They're not, but they demonstrate we're in communication and right now being associated with the wrong people. I am the wrong people, she said without rancor. I'm a lovegood. Half the school thinks I'm mad. I write for the Quibbler, which the ministry currently considers unreliable at best and seditious at worst. She tilted her head. Are you worried about being seen with me? He looked at her directly. No, he said. I'm worried about you being put in Umbridge's line of sight because of me. Something shifted in her face, very small, very quick, gone before he could name it precisely. But he'd seen it, and it had been real, and it was not nothing. That's very considerate, she said. But I'm already in Umbridge's line of sight. She looked at me during the welcoming feast the way people look at things they intend to deal with eventually. She picked up her quill. I'd rather be in her line of sight for something real than for nothing. A pause. Besides, if she searches my things, all she'll find is quibblers and a jar of dried moondew fern, which is not yet illegal. He almost smiled. Not yet. The year is young. She returned to her notes. I'll find a different channel for the research correspondence. My father knows people who are very good at discretion. He stayed and they worked in silence, him on his potions essay, her on whatever she was researching with the complexity of someone who had created their own filing system, and it was good. It was the specific comfort of working next to someone whose presence was steady and real and not demanding anything. After an hour he said quietly into the library, quiet, Luna. She looked up. I'm glad we write letters. She held his gaze for a moment, those pale, clear eyes, and said with the same care he'd started recognizing as her register for the things that mattered most, so am I. Then she went back to her notes. He went back to his potions essay. Neither of them said anything else, and it was completely enough. The DA session 3 days later was the most advanced one yet. Harry had moved them past individual spells and into combinations, casting sequences the way a real confrontation moved. Neville had been thinking about this in terms of the spatial geometry he'd developed, force and angle, leverage and counterpoint, and he was, by this point, consistently among the top performers in the room, which was a sentence he couldn't have imagined writing about himself in any class 1 year ago. Harry had them working in pairs on an exercise, 1 offensive, 1 defensive, roles switching every 60 seconds, and Neville found himself facing Luna. They squared off. She had that sideways stance she'd been developing since October, weight distributed differently from the standard dueling position, which moved her center of gravity and made her harder to predict. He knew this. He'd watched her develop it over 2 months. She knew he knew. He could see it in the slight smile. He raised his wand. She moved first, not with a spell but with a step, fluid and quick, changing her angle to him, and he'd been expecting it, and so he'd already started moving, and they ended up in a geometry that was nothing like standard dueling form, closer quarters, facing each other at an oblique angle, both of them with their wands up and expressions of concentrated intent focus. Expelliarmus, she said. He turned it, not blocked, let it slide past him, redirected harmlessly into the floor. Her eyes lit up. He cast a protego shaped differently from standard, tighter and more directional, more like a deflecting surface than a wall, and followed it immediately with a reducto at reduced power, calibrated, not the explosion he'd produced last time but a focus push. She stepped sideways, of course she did, but she'd barely finished the step when he cast again, having anticipated the sidestep, and she had to produce a shield charm very quickly, and it was good. It was really good, and they both knew it. They stopped at the same moment, not because either had won but because they'd both arrived at the limit of what the exercise was designed for and kept going past it anyway, and it felt like what playing chess with someone of exactly equal but differently applied skill felt like. It felt like a conversation. Harry whistled low. Okay, yeah, save that for the real thing. Around them, other pairs had slowed to watch them at some point without either of them noticing. Ron's mouth was slightly open. Hermione was writing something quickly in a small notebook with the expression of someone capturing something for theoretical review. Neville and Luna looked at each other. She was breathing slightly faster than usual, and there was color in her cheeks, and she looked completely, electrically alive. You knew I'd step right, she said. I know how you move, he said. She tilted her head, the assessment gesture, the one he'd catalogued in September and had been adding to ever since. But what overlaid it now was something different. Recognition, not the intellectual recognition of someone identifying an interesting fact, but the other kind, the kind that goes deeper. Yes, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. You do. He lowered his wand, she lowered hers. They walked back to the perimeter of the room and picked up their water and didn't discuss it. And after the session ended and people were dispersing, Neville walked next to her down the 7th floor corridor and said nothing, and she said nothing, and it was the very best kind of nothing, the kind that is actually full of something specific that both people know is there and neither has named yet. At the junction, before she turned toward Ravenclaw, she stopped. Neville, she said. He stopped too. She turned to face him, and she was direct as always, direct as she had been about everything from the train to the greenhouse to the library, direct in the way that had clarified him and unsettled him and consistently told him true things he needed to know. I want to be honest with you about something, she said, because I think you prefer honesty to comfort, which is one of the things I like most about you. He waited. "I've never had a friend like you before," she said. "The other Ravenclaws are fine. Ginny is very dear to me. But you," she chose the next words carefully, which was unusual for her, which meant something. "You talk to me like my ideas are real and my feelings are valid and my strangeness is not a problem to be solved. And that's not a pause, that's not a common experience for me." He was very still. "I thought you should know that," she said, "because I don't think you know how much it matters, what you do when you listen to me." He thought of a dozen ways to respond. He set all of them aside. "Luna," he said, "the same goes exactly and completely." He paused. "And I want to be honest with you too because I'm learning it from you and I think it's the right approach." He took a breath. "You are the most clarifying presence in my life right now, and I don't mean that as a small thing, I mean it as the biggest thing I know how to say tonight." Her expression was very quiet, very still. The torchlight was doing its amber work and her eyes were very clear and she looked, he thought, like someone recognizing something they had been hoping for without letting themselves hope for it. "That's a very big thing," she said. "I know," she nodded once. "Good night, Neville Longbottom," she said, back to the full name but different now somehow, not formal, the opposite of formal, the way you'd use a full name to say I see all of you. "Good night, Luna Lovegood," he said back. She turned and went, and he stood at the junction, and the torch flickered, and somewhere deep in the building something settled into a new configuration, the way plants did sometimes overnight, growing without making any noise, arriving somewhere new by morning. He went up to bed. He lay in the dark and breathed, and did not dream about his parents, and thought about the way she'd said one of the things I like most about you, which was plural, which meant there were others, which was the most significant botanical emotional discovery he'd made in a year of considerable discoveries. He fell asleep smiling, which Ron would have had extensive commentary on, and which Neville was deeply grateful Ron was too asleep to witness. Outside, the January night was clear and very cold, and the stars were sharp above the castle, and in Ravenclaw Tower a lamp burned late, and he hoped it was hers. He was fairly certain it was. Chapter 4, How to Love Someone You're Not Allowed to Save the DA was discovered on a Tuesday. It happened the way bad things tend to happen, not with a dramatic warning, not with the slow build of something you've been bracing for, but quickly and sideways, the way a plant goes from healthy to dying in the span of a single overnight frost. One moment the world was the world, and the next it was something worse, and the distance between those two states was the length of a corridor and a single act of betrayal. Neville didn't know it had happened at first. He was in the greenhouses with Professor Sprout going over the final documentation for the correcting creeper paper, which was due to the journal by the end of the month, and needed one more set of supporting data that only the Hogwarts greenhouse conditions could produce. He had ink on his wrist and dirt under his nails, and he was in the middle of explaining his soil composition rationale when Ginny appeared at the greenhouse door, slightly out of breath. He knew from her face before she said anything. "DA," she said, "Marietta Edgecombe." Umbridge caught them in the room of requirement. Professor Sprout set down her quill with a quietness that was its own kind of statement. Neville's first thought, which he was not proud of, was the staggered entrance plan. They'd implemented it in January. It had reduced the visibility risk considerably, but you couldn't plan for someone in the room itself. That was the failure point he hadn't accounted for, the one that had been there the whole time, not the approach, not the access, but the interior, the human element. "Harry," he said, "in Dumbledore's office, Umbridge has him." Ginny's voice was controlled. She was very good at controlled, which had always been one of the most Ginny things about her. "She's claiming it's an illegal student organization. She's got ministry muscle with her. It's Neville, it's bad." He was already moving. The school had changed in the time it took him to walk from the greenhouse to the castle entrance. That was the only way to describe it. The physical building was identical. The stones were the same stones, but the quality of the space was different, the way a greenhouse feels different when something has died in it during the night. Students were moving in small, tight clusters, talking low. Prefects were everywhere, looking uncertain about their mandate. Two wizards he didn't recognize were standing at the main corridor intersection with the unmistakable posture of people who are present to be seen, official, ministry sent. The inquisitorial squad. He'd heard about it in the abstract, Umbridge's selected enforcement arm, mostly Slytherins, authority delegated from ministry mandate. Seeing it in practice was different from the abstract. The badge on Draco Malfoy's robes caught the corridor torchlight, and Malfoy was wearing it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of moment. Neville walked past him without slowing down. Malfoy said, "Not so confident now, Longbottom." Neville didn't break stride, didn't look at him. "Still taller than you," he said, which was not actually true but was the first thing that arrived, and it landed correctly. He could tell by the silence behind him, and he turned the corner and kept going. He found Hermione in the corridor outside the defense classroom, Ron beside her, both of them wearing the expression of people who have been running disaster calculations for 30 minutes and haven't liked any of the results. "Tell me," he said. Hermione told him. Marietta Edgecombe chose friend, who had never been entirely comfortable with the risk, who had apparently decided at some point that Umbridge was the more immediate danger and acted accordingly. The jinx Hermione had put on the parchment had fired. Marietta's face was covered in suppurating pustules that spelled sneak, which had protected everyone else's identities from Umbridge's questions, but Umbridge had found the room, had found Harry there. Dumbledore, Hermione said, and her voice was careful in the way it got when she was managing something that wanted to break loose, has taken responsibility. He told Umbridge and Fudge it was his organization. He's gone. He left the school rather than be arrested. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. Gone, Neville said. He left. Ron's voice was slightly rough. He sent his phoenix at Fudge and just apparated. They couldn't stop him. A pause. Means Umbridge is headmistress, Hermione finished. 3 beats of silence. Right, said Neville. He looked at the corridor around them, at the ministry officials at the junction, at the shape the school had become in the space of a morning. So we adapt. Hermione looked at him. The DA isn't over, he said. It needs to be quieter, smaller groups, less frequent, different location. He was already thinking it through. The room of requirement is compromised. Umbridge knows about it. But the castle has other spaces. I know 3 separate locations that aren't on any map I've ever seen. Ron blinked. How do you know about unmapped rooms? I've been sneaking out to the greenhouses at night for 4 years. He said it without particular emphasis. You learn the building. Hermione looked at him for a long moment with her recalibrating expression, which he was used to by now. All right, she said, but not yet. Give it a week. Let Umbridge settle into thinking she's won. It was sound strategy. He agreed with it. He went to his classes, which now had a different texture to them. Defense was openly, pointlessly theoretical, Umbridge conducting her sessions with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose authority is newly total. McGonagall conducted transfiguration with a precision so controlled it was almost aggressive, every movement of her wand sharp as a sentence in an argument. Flitwick seemed to have aged 5 years since yesterday. Hagrid looked like someone waiting for the next blow. Through all of it, Neville was present and paying attention and quiet, which was a different kind of quiet from the quiet he'd been doing for years. The old quiet was avoidance. This quiet was surveillance. He was in the Great Hall at dinner 3 days after the DA's discovery when the question of Luna arrived. She came in through the main doors with 3 other Ravenclaws late. She was often late to meals, lost in something, and when she looked across the hall and found him at the Gryffindor table, there was a brief exchange of information in the look, the kind that doesn't need words because you've built enough of a shared language to make words redundant. She sat at the Ravenclaw table. He looked down at his food. He'd been watching her for the past 3 days with a specific, private worry that he hadn't shared with anyone because it wasn't his to share. Umbridge had, since becoming headmistress, done a cataloguing of potential disruption sources. Students who had loudly questioned ministry positions, students with connections to known opposition figures, students who, in the taxonomy of institutional authority, represented loose ends. Luna Lovegood, daughter of the editor of the Quibbler, who had published multiple articles calling Fudge incompetent and Voldemort's return documented fact, was a very specific kind of loose end. He'd been watching Umbridge watch Luna. He'd been doing it carefully without making it obvious, but he'd been doing it, and what he'd seen had not improved his appetite. After dinner in the corridor, he fell into step beside her. "How are you?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness she applied to all questions. "I'm all right. The Ravenclaw Tower has been slightly hostile since I mentioned in the common room that Umbridge reminded me of a Rotfang conspiracy proxy, which I stand by, but the social atmosphere has deteriorated." She said this with serenity. "Luna," he dropped his voice, "I've been watching Umbridge's attention. She's been noting you." A very brief pause. "I know, you know. I've been watching her watching me since September. She looked at me at the welcoming feast the way I told you then." She glanced sideways at him. "I've been careful about what I say and where, but the Quibbler, my father, will keep publishing. I can't ask him not to." Her voice was level, but he heard something under it, something carrying weight. "He's the only thing left of my mother's, of what she believed about speaking truth. I can't ask him to stop." He walked beside her in silence for a moment. The corridor was occupied, 2 inquisitorial squad members at the end, the specific surveillance presence that was now Hogwarts' new normal. "I need you to be careful," he said. "More careful than usual, not quiet. I know you won't be quiet, and I'm not asking you to be, but careful." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. The inquisitorial squad members were far enough away. She turned to face him, and her expression was, it was not distressed. It was something he was learning to distinguish from her default serenity, something warmer and more specific. "You're worried about me," she said. He looked at her directly. "Yes, I have been for the past 3 days, somewhat constantly." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the small shift in her breathing, the thing her eyes did. "That's new for me," she said quietly. "What is?" "Someone worrying about me." Specifically, she paused. "My father worries about me in a general way. Ginny worries about whether I'm happy. You're worried about the specific physical danger I might be in and have apparently been running calculations on it for 3 days without telling me." She tilted her head. "Why didn't you tell me before now?" "I was trying to figure out if there was something actionable I could do about it before He stopped, started again. "I didn't want to worry you for nothing." "That," she said, "is exactly the kind of thing I was talking about, the night in the greenhouse." She held his gaze. "You think about what other people need before you say things. You're always calculating how to be less of a burden." A pause. "You're allowed to come to me with unresolved worries, Neville. I'd rather have them than not." The corridor was quiet. The torch above them was steady. "Okay," he said. "Then I'm worried about you, and I don't have a fully formed solution. And it bothers me more than most things bother me right now." "That's better," she said simply. "Thank you." She started walking again. He walked beside her. "There's something else," she said after a moment. "What? I've been worried about you too since the DA was discovered." A pause. "You were one of the most active members. If Umbridge is building a case, if she gets access to a more complete list, Marietta only knew the people she'd interacted with directly. You're visible." "I know." "Your grandmother would be. How would she respond?" He considered this honestly. His grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, who wore a stuffed vulture on her hat and had been telling him since childhood that he didn't live up to his parents, who was, underneath all of that, a woman who had survived the First War, who had kept the family together through the worst years, who proudly, probably, he said, and found as he said it that he believed it. Whatever she thought about the risk, he paused. "She told me before I came back this year," she said, "Neville, your father fought for this world and he'd want you to too. It's the first time she's ever said anything like that to me." A breath. "I don't think she meant for it to mean as much as it did." Luna's expression was very quiet. Grandmothers often don't know the weight of what they're giving when they give the true things. They reached the Ravenclaw junction, the parting point. He stopped and she stopped, and it was dark and torchlit and familiar, this specific spot. They'd had more significant conversations here than anywhere else in the castle, and the Stones probably had opinions by now. "Neville," she said, "Luna, I want to say something and I want to say it correctly." She was choosing her words with the unusual care she reserved for important things, and he was completely still, completely present, waiting. "The past months since the train, since September, they've been different from every other year at Hogwarts, different from my life before you, honestly." A pause. "I'm not good at needing people. I learned very early that it was a vulnerability because people leave or they're taken and then the needing itself becomes a wound." She breathed. "But I find that you are someone I would be significantly less myself without." And I wanted to say that out loud in plain language because I said honesty was how I operated and I should operate it in all directions, including this one. He was very quiet for a moment. "Luna," he said her name carefully, the way she said things she meant. "I know what you mean about learning not to need people." He thought about 4 years of being the background character in every room he occupied, the one who dropped things and apologized. "I've been doing that my whole life. Needing as little as possible so the inevitable disappointment would be smaller." A breath. "I don't do that with you. I haven't, not since the train. And the difference it makes is," he searched for the scale of it, "it's like the difference between gardening in the dark and gardening in daylight. The same actions, completely different results." Her expression was very still, very clear. "That's the best metaphor I've ever received," she said, and her voice was slightly different, softer at the edges, less constructed, the version of her voice he'd only heard a handful of times, in the greenhouse at 2 in the morning and other specific moments when the serenity lowered enough to show what was underneath. He wanted, with a specificity that surprised him, to close the distance between them. He recognized this clearly and honestly, which was something new. The old Neville would have buried it under 12 layers of self-doubt before it reached the surface. He didn't close the distance, not because he was afraid, but because the moment had its own timing and forcing it would ruin the thing it was. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Be careful tonight." "You too," she said. "And Neville," she hesitated, which was unusual enough to be significant, "whatever happens with Umbridge. Whatever happens this year." She met his eyes. "I'm glad we're on the same side." "There's no other side I'd be on," he said. She nodded. She went up toward Ravenclaw Tower. He stood at the junction and breathed and understood, with a clarity that was a little like being hit by something at low speed, that whatever this was between them had crossed a line that neither of them had announced but both of them had felt, and that the only question remaining was what they were going to do with it, and that the answer to that question was probably going to be complicated by the fact that the world was currently on fire. He went upstairs. He didn't sleep for a long time, which had nothing to do with bad dreams. The confrontation with Montague happened the following week. Neville was cutting across a third-floor corridor on his way from herbology, a longer route than necessary, but the direct route had 2 inquisitorial squad members on it, and he'd been developing the habit of not generating unnecessary surveillance material. He was thinking about the correcting creeper documentation, about a secondary application he'd identified that Professor Sprout hadn't mentioned, and he wanted to raise with her when he heard a sound. Not a dramatic sound, just the specific, particular sound of someone saying stop in the way that means it isn't the first time they've said it. He turned the corner. Graham Montague, 6th year Slytherin, inquisitorial squad, big in the way that people are when they've been encouraged to use their size as an argument, had a second-year Hufflepuff student backed against the wall. The student was trying to be invisible, which was understandable but wasn't working. Montague was making a point about something. The content didn't matter, the tone did. The tone of someone who has been given a badge and has decided the badge changes what he's allowed to do. Neville stopped. He took in the scene with the quick, complete assessment he'd been developing since September. Montague's position, the second year's face, the distance and the geometry, whether there was anyone else in the corridor. There wasn't. "Montague," he said. Montague turned. The second year used the moment to remove themselves from the immediate vicinity, which was the correct call. Montague watched the second year go, then looked back at Neville with the expression of someone choosing a new target. "Longbottom," he said, "you're a long way from your greenhouse. Third floor herbology's on the ground floor, so yes. Neville walked toward him steadily, not quickly, not slowly. What are you doing? Inquisitorial business. He tapped the badge, which is ministry-sanctioned and above your authority to question. The ministry-sanctioned authority of a sixth-year student, Neville said, doesn't extend to physically intimidating second years in empty corridors, which is not a defense against the dark arts position, which is just a bully position. He stopped a few feet from Montague. I'd put it away. Montague's eyes narrowed. He had 50 pounds on Neville and 4 inches of height and the confidence of someone who had been told the power structure was on his side. You want to try something? Montague said. No, Neville said honestly. I don't want to try anything. I don't like fighting. I'm a herbology person. A pause. But I want to be clear that if you want to try something, you should know what you're trying something with, which is someone who has been practicing practical spellwork seriously since September, and you might want to factor that into your assessment before you commit to anything. The corridor was very quiet. Montague had his wand out. Neville had not drawn his yet. He was watching Montague's arm with the specific attention he brought to a plant that was about to do something, watching for the preparatory tension, the micro-movement. He saw it. He had his wand out and the protego up before Montague's spell was halfway out of his mouth, and it deflected cleanly, not into the wall but redirected, the angle technique he'd been developing for months, and the reflected energy clipped a suit of armor in the alcove behind Montague with a crash that rang down the corridor. Montague stared at his own spell's aftermath. I reflected it, Neville said helpfully. That's the angle technique, I've been working on it. He kept his voice even, not taunting, just factual. You could try again, but I'd suggest it's more likely to go worse for you than better, and there's a suit of armor back there that would like the opportunity to tell that story to someone. Montague's face went through several colors. He was calculating, Neville could see it, the cost-benefit of escalating versus the damage of backing down visibly, and the calculation took 10 seconds, which was 9 seconds longer than it would have taken Draco Malfoy, who was quicker and colder. Montague lowered his wand. This isn't finished, he said, which was the thing people said when they decided it was finished but needed the exit line. Probably not, Neville agreed. Have a good afternoon. Montague left. Neville stood in the corridor alone for a moment, with the crashed suit of armor and the echo of the spell and his wand still in his hand. He was very steady. He noted this with the quiet satisfaction of someone checking a measurement and finding it correct. He put his wand away and went to find Professor Sprout. But it was Luna he told about it that evening in the library, not boasting, not processing, just telling her the way he'd taken to telling her things he'd learned, because she responded to information about the world with the exact quality of attention that made it worth having. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The reflection technique, she said, worked perfectly. He paused. Better than in practice, actually. Situations add something. Stakes clarify the nervous system, she said. The same way dangerous plants require more precision and get it because the stakes of imprecision are higher. She looked at him. You didn't use more force than you needed. No, there wasn't any reason to. That's important, she said with a seriousness that made him think she meant something beyond the tactical. People with power often use more than necessary because the excess is the point, the power for its own sake. She paused. You used exactly what the situation required and no more. That's rarer than the power itself. He looked at her across the library table. The evening light was coming sideways through the windows, the last of the winter light, thin and gold. Luna, he said. She looked up. Is there a word in any of the things you've read, and I know you've read a lot, for the thing that happens when someone understands you in the exact way you most need to be understood, specifically that? Not generally, but that particular thing. She was very still for a moment, thinking he knew, really thinking, not stalling. There's a word in Finnish, she said finally. Seelinitis. It means soul connection, literally. The Finns used it to describe the experience of meeting someone whose inner world maps directly onto yours, not the same inner world but complementary, like two plants in companion planting that produce more together than either produces alone. A pause. I've never actually used it about a person before. He held her gaze. I have now, she said, and looked back at her book, and the tips of her ears had gone a very particular shade of pink that he had not seen before and filed away immediately in the most important category. The following days were thick with tension. Umbridge had installed herself in the headmistress's office, Dumbledore's office technically, though the portraits of former headmasters had promptly gone to sleep in their frames and refused to be consulted, and was conducting a systematic review of school operations. Teachers were called in individually. Lessons were inspected. The decree monitoring had expanded to the common rooms. Neville kept his head down in class, did his work with complete attention. Said nothing that could be interpreted as sedition while also not saying anything false, which was a difficult balance that required a kind of constant, low-level alertness. The DA met twice in a storage room off the fourth-floor corridor that Neville had identified, 6 people at a time, 10-minute intervals. Smaller, more exposed, but operational. Harry's expression when Neville brought him the location, having scouted it, checked the sight lines, identified 2 alternate exits, was worth precisely what it cost to set up. You found this, Harry said, looking at the room. 4th floor, east wing. The caretaker's records show it as a disused storage space going back to 1800. It's not on the Marauder's map. Harry looked at him. How do you know what's on the Marauder's map? Because you've had it out in the common room 3 times this week. He wasn't accusatory about it. I looked. Right. Harry turned back to the room. This is good, Neville. It's something, Neville said. It's not the room of requirement, but it's something. They ran 2 sessions there, small groups, quick, focused, less spectacular than the full DA, but real, the essential thing, the actual practice maintained. It was after the second session that Ginny caught up with him in the corridor, slightly ahead of the others, and said, in a tone that was elaborately casual in the way of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for several days. So, Luna, he kept walking. What about Luna? Don't, Ginny said, pleasantly. You sat at the wrong table on the first morning of term to eat breakfast with her. You had a 2-hour walk in the dark to nowhere, Neville, which I know about because she mentioned it to me while trying to make it sound like a normal thing that people do. You defended your practice partner against Montague in an empty corridor. She looked at him sideways. I'm not criticizing, I'm observing. You're Ginny, he said. You're always doing both. She grinned. She's my friend. I know. And she considered, you're someone I've watched get overlooked for 4 years and get increasingly difficult to overlook, and now you're hard to look away from, and she stopped. I just want to make sure you know what's happening with you and her. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He thought about the finished word Luna had told him, about the greenhouse at 2 in the morning, about the way she'd said I've never actually used it about a person before, and then immediately said I have now. About the tips of her ears. I know what's happening, he said. Ginny studied his face for a moment in the direct, assessing Weasley way. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. Good, she said, because she's not. People have been careless with her for years, Neville. She doesn't say so because she's Luna, but she's the kind of person who can be. The loss gets absorbed without a sound is what I'm saying. I know, he said quietly. And Ginny paused, you won't be careless. It wasn't a question, he answered it anyway. No, I won't. She nodded again, final this time, and they walked back to the common room, and she said nothing more about it, and neither did he, and it sat between them as understood. February arrived. The castle had its rhythms, and the rhythms went on: lessons, meals, DA sessions, the constant low-grade surveillance of Umbridge's regime. Harry was increasingly tense with something Neville recognized as a secret that was too big for one person's interior, something that was pressing outward from behind his eyes. Harry's occlumency lessons with Snape were happening. Nobody was supposed to know, but the school's information ecosystem was too dense and too social for real privacy, and the thing pressing behind Harry's eyes was connected to whatever was happening in those lessons. Neville didn't ask. He watched and kept his counsel and was ready. He was in the greenhouse on a Saturday afternoon in late February when Luna appeared at the door, which was unusual. She came to him here occasionally now, but usually with some pretext, a botanical question or a follow-up to something they'd discussed. She appeared without pretext this time. She stood in the doorway of the greenhouse, and her face was doing something he had to look at carefully to decode because it was subtle. The serenity was intact, but under it something had been shaken. He put down his trowel. What happened? She came in, letting the door close behind her. The greenhouse was warm, the afternoon light coming through the glass at a low angle. She stood in the middle of the growing space and looked at him. My father's press was raided, she said. Last night, ministry officials under educational decree authority, which doesn't actually extend to private publishing presses, but they're apparently unconcerned about the technical legality. She breathed carefully. They didn't destroy anything. They confiscated the last 2 issues worth of printing materials and told him that the Quibbler was under review as a publication of potentially seditious content. She paused. He owled me this morning. He's all right. My father is very difficult to frighten. He's already started handwriting the next issue. The ghost of something, not a smile but related to one, crossed her face briefly. But I wanted to. She stopped. Luna. He went to her, closing the distance across the greenhouse floor, and he stood in front of her and looked at her properly. Up close, the serenity was clearly doing the work of several other things. Her hands were not entirely still. I wanted to come here, she said. I didn't. A pause, and what he heard in the pause was someone who had been alone with something for several hours and had reached the limit of that. I didn't want to be in the tower. He did something then that was not complicated, was simply correct. He reached out and put his hand over hers, not tightly, just there, present. She looked down at his hand for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and held his, and there was a quality to the grip that said several things simultaneously, none of which needed to be turned into sentences. They stood in the greenhouse for a while in the warm green light, with the plants doing their quiet, continuous work around them. He's going to keep publishing, Neville said. Yes, and you're not going to ask him to stop. No, I'm not, because it's what she believed in. Luna was quiet for a moment. Because it's what's true, she said. The Quibbler is what's true right now. My father is one of the only people publishing the truth, and the ministry raiding his office means the truth is inconvenient to them, which means we should want more of it, not less. He nodded. He squeezed her hand once, gently. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the greenhouse was warm and green and quiet, and outside the February light was going flat and gold, and the distance that had been slowly, consistently, deliberately closing between them since September was, in this moment, in this particular configuration of warmth and worry and hands, very small. He thought about closing it the rest of the way. She was watching him think about it, which was something she did. She watched his thinking with that complete, uncomplicated attention, like someone who found the interior of another person genuinely interesting rather than something to manage. He closed the distance slowly and without drama, not the way it happened in stories, all sudden and gasping, but the way things happened between two people who had been building towards something honestly and knew the shape of it when it arrived. He pressed his mouth briefly, gently to her forehead, which was what arrived first, and then he leaned back and looked at her. She was very still. He waited. That was, she started. Not exactly what I intended to do, he said, but it felt right. It was right, she said. It was, she paused, with the specific quality of someone finding vocabulary for a new experience. Someone has never done something like that for me before. Something that had no purpose other than being gentle. He looked at her for a long moment. Luna, he said, carefully and plainly and with everything he had. I have something to say and I need to say it properly. All right, I'm not good at declarations. I'm better at quiet things, at gradual things, at the kind of work that happens over a long season rather than in one afternoon. He breathed. But I want to be clear what this is between us. I don't want it to be something we work around the edges of until something forces a definition. I want to say I'm in this. Whatever this is, I'm paying attention to you in a way I'm not paying attention to anything else, and that's deliberate and chosen, and I want you to know it. The greenhouse was very quiet. Luna looked at him with those grey eyes, clear and steady and fully present, and when she spoke her voice was the one he'd only heard a few times, the underneath one, the one without armor. I'm in this too, she said. I have been since the train, possibly since before the train, which doesn't make rational sense but is factually true. He felt the tectonic thing again, the deep, final, settling movement that had been intermittent since September and was now just becoming the ground state. Permanent rearrangement. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. They stood in the warm greenhouse, and she kept hold of his hand, and the afternoon went gold and then amber outside the glass, and it was the finest thing he could remember feeling in his life. He thought of his greenhouse dream, the quiet one, the person on the stool in the corner, reading. He understood now what he'd known then without knowing he knew it. He walked her back to the castle when the light went, and they parted at the junction as always, but differently. The parting was different, carried different weight, was not an ending but a punctuation. He went up to Gryffindor Tower. He did not notice Ron watching him come through the portrait hole with an expression of comprehensive awareness, or Ron putting down his exploding snap cards, or Ron saying, "Mate." He noticed none of that until Ron said it again louder. "Mate." He turned. What? Ron looked at him with the vast, patient knowledge of someone who has been observing something from a distance and has now had all suspicions confirmed. "Nothing," Ron said. "Good for you," and picked up his exploding snap cards again. Neville went up to the dormitory. He sat on his bed for a long time in the dark behind the curtains, with the warmth of the greenhouse still in his hands, and the weight of the world outside that was accumulating towards something. He could feel it, the way you felt a storm coming in, the pressure on certain plants, the way the air changes before something breaks, and he was not afraid of it. He was ready. He just needed to be ready long enough. Chapter 5, The Battle of the Department of Mysteries. The thing about the night everything happened was that it started with a lie. Not a strategic lie, not a deliberate one, just the kind of lie that a 16-year-old boy tells himself when the alternative is too terrible to sit with. Harry had seen his godfather. Had seen Sirius Black being tortured in the Department of Mysteries, in the room with the archway, and had believed it with the total conviction of someone who loves someone and cannot conceive of a world that would use that love as a weapon. Neville found out in the corridor outside Umbridge's office, where 5 of them had been caught. He'd known something was happening before any of it broke into the open, had felt it in Harry's face at dinner, in the specific quality of Harry's distraction, which was different from his usual distraction, sharper and more desperate. When Ginny had pulled him aside after dinner and said something's wrong with Harry, he'd already been moving in that direction. He didn't know, when he walked into Umbridge's office with the others, that he was walking toward the Department of Mysteries. He didn't know it when Hermione spun the brilliant, audacious lie that led Umbridge into the Forbidden Forest. He didn't know it when the Thestrals arrived, pale and enormous in the dark between the trees. He knew it when Harry said, "We're going to London," and mounted the Thestrals back, and something in Neville's chest said yes with the completeness of something that had been waiting. He climbed up onto a Thestral's back without hesitation. He still couldn't see them. The creature was invisible, warm and solid under his hands, the real thing present without visual form. He thought briefly of Luna in the carriages on the first night of term, standing still and looking at something only she could see, and him understanding that he would be able to see it too, eventually. Luna climbed up beside him. Not on the same Thestral, there were enough for each of them, but beside him in the dark, with her hair moving in the night air and her expression the same one she wore for Thestrals and extraordinary things, open, accepting, completely present. "You can feel them," she said, "even if you can't see them." "Yes," he said. "That's enough," she said. They lifted into the dark. The flight to London was cold and enormous and unlike anything Neville had experienced, the castle falling away below, the grounds becoming a texture rather than a place. the sky opening up into a darkness that was also full, stars overhead and the lights of the Muggle world below, the two sets of illumination existing in complete indifference to each other. He kept his hands in the invisible mane and his legs against the invisible flanks and felt the creature's rhythm, the living warmth of it, and thought very clearly and practically about what they were flying toward. He thought about the Department of Mysteries, about what he knew of it, which was limited, the Ministry sealed division, the place where they studied the forces that couldn't be explained or categorized, the room with the archway that Harry had seen in his visions all year. He thought about 6 of them, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Luna and himself, going into a place designed to confuse and disorient with whatever was waiting for them inside. He was not afraid. He registered this with honest clarity. There was something that might have been called adrenaline, a physical alertness, a sharpening of every sense, but fear, the kind that locked your hands and emptied your wand, the kind he'd spent most of his life swimming in, that wasn't present. I have been preparing for something. I didn't know it was this specific thing, but I've been preparing. He looked sideways. Luna was riding her the strahl with the unhurried competence of someone who finds the invisible world more interesting than strange. Her eyes were on the dark ahead, her face calm, and she must have felt him looking because she turned. She said something, but the wind took it. He leaned slightly. "What?" I said, she called over the rushing air, "that I'm glad it's us. The 6 of us," she paused, "we're a good combination." He thought about this seriously because she always meant serious things seriously. Harry, who had faced Voldemort and come back. Hermione, who was the best practical magical mind of their generation. Ron, steadier than he looked and braver than he knew. Ginny, quick and fierce and underestimated by everyone who wasn't paying attention. Luna, who saw what others didn't and thought about everything differently. And him. "Yes," he said, "we are." The Ministry of Magic at midnight was a different building than the Ministry of Magic during the day. The Muggle entrance, the phone box, was cold and clinical, and the automated voice that announced their arrival to an empty atrium sounded ghostly, its bureaucratic cheerfulness belonging to a different kind of day entirely. Their footsteps rang on the golden floor. The great fountain was still, its water dark. The lifts descended. The Department of Mysteries corridor was low and black, and the doors were identical, and there was no way of knowing where they led until you opened them, which was designed to be that way, which was the whole point of the place. Harry led. Neville watched him do it, watch Harry in the way he'd been watching him all year, measuring the change. The boy walking through the Department of Mysteries was not the boy who had stumbled through the Triwizard Tournament. He was something more formed, more sure, moving toward his godfather with the certainty of someone who will not be stopped. Neville hoped Sirius was there. The thought arrived with the weight of something he didn't want to sit with fully, so he set it aside. They found the Hall of Prophecy by following Harry, who had been in this place in his dreams, and moved through it with the particular familiarity of a location half known. Tall racks, glass spheres, the dim cold light that didn't quite illuminate anything fully, the sound of 6 people trying to be quiet in a large, echoing space, and then they found the sphere, Harry's name on the label and Voldemort's, and the terrible intimacy of a 16-year-old boy's destiny in a glass orb on a shelf. Harry picked it up. The moment he did, the light changed. 12 of them, stepping out of the dark between the racks with the particular efficiency of people who had been in position for some time, waiting. Death Eaters, masked, robed, moving without urgency, which was its own kind of menace. 12 against 6 in a closed space, and 4 of the 6 were 16 years old. Lucius Malfoy, unmasked, with his father's particular brand of confidence that has never been challenged by reality, at least not yet, not quite stepped forward. "Give us the prophecy, Potter," he said with the tone of someone who considers the outcome settled, "and perhaps none of your friends need be hurt." Neville kept his hands very still. His wand was in his grip, and he was watching the room in the same way he'd watched Montague's wand arm, the preparatory tensions, the micro-movement, the geometry of where each Death Eater was positioned relative to the racks, the exits, each other, and the 6 of them. He counted, he calculated. He was aware of Luna 2 feet to his left, Ginny to his right, Hermione and Ron behind Harry, Harry in the center with the prophecy in his hand. He'd been in situations before where being the background person was the only option, where the geometry of power required you to make yourself small because making yourself large would accelerate bad outcomes. He knew exactly what that felt like. This was not that. He'd also been in situations where size could be used, the specific advantage of someone underestimated, someone whose capacity hasn't been read correctly. He knew what that felt like now too. He tilted his head very slightly toward Luna without looking at her. She responded. He saw her weight shift in his peripheral vision, one tiny adjustment, confirmation. "No," Harry said to Lucius Malfoy, and the word was absolute. Everything broke open. The first spells came from multiple angles simultaneously, and the hall erupted into light and noise and motion, and Neville moved not away from it, but toward the geometry that made sense. He went left toward the base of the nearest rack, drawing 2 of the Death Eaters' attention with a reducto that he threw hard and fast into the rack above them, sending glass spheres cascading, and the 2 Death Eaters had to dive aside, which opened a line for him. He heard Ginny yell a hex, something sharp, and then a blast that shook the floor, and Hermione's voice casting something fast and technical. Harry was in the center of it, the prophecy still in his hand, Malfoy trying to close the distance to him. Luna was moving. She wasn't moving like most people moved in a fight, which was forward or backward or sideways in predictable ways. She moved the way she did in the DA, diagonally, changing her angle, making herself a difficult geometric target, her wand out and her casting quiet and precise. She blocked a stunner with a shield charm that she angled so the deflected energy hit a different Death Eater's knee and buckled them. Then she kept moving before they could track her. Neville dealt with the two Death Eaters he'd knocked sideways. They were up, both of them, and one was faster than the other, a woman short and quick with her wand already leveled. He threw a Protego that took her stunner and redirected it into the rack behind him, then came back immediately with a Reducto that hit the rack in front of her, not at her, at the rack, collapsing the shelves, creating an obstacle, using the room itself as his tool. The second one hit him with something that clipped his shoulder, not a direct hit, a glancing impact of a stunning spell, and his arm went heavy and half-numb, but he kept his wand because his grip was in his wrist now, the technique he'd developed, not the white-knuckle clench of someone who'd spent years strangling the spell before it left. He cast a full-force Expelliarmus, angled low at the second Death Eater's wand hand. Not a small, controlled Expelliarmus, the version he'd been building since September, since the day the dummy exploded, the version that came from his whole body and his understanding of force and leverage and the precise point of application. The Death Eater's wand hit the far wall. He was already turning. The hall was chaos, spheres shattering, glass everywhere, prophecies whispering their last words as they broke, light from a dozen simultaneous spells crossing and colliding. Ron was down, he'd taken something, was sitting against a rack shaking his head, Hermione trying to get to him and held back by a Death Eater between them. Ginny had been hit, her ankle, something wrong with it, but she was standing and still casting, bracing against a shelf. Harry was running, Malfoy's voice cutting through the noise after him, and Neville looked at the geometry of the room with the speed of someone who had been doing this in practice for months, and understood immediately. Malfoy was going to cut him off before he reached the next chamber. He cast the Reductor Curse sideways, not at a person, at the shelving unit between Malfoy and Harry, and the unit collapsed outward and Malfoy had to stop and go around it, and Harry was through the chamber door before Malfoy recovered. A hand closed on Neville's arm. He'd been tracking 4 things at once and the 5th got him, a Death Eater to his right, close, too close for wand work, and he felt the grip on his arm and his wand arm being forced up. He didn't struggle against the grip. He went with it, let the Death Eater pull, let the motion carry through, and then stepped hard into the Death Eater's body inside his reach, which was exactly the wrong place to be from the Death Eater's perspective because he couldn't use his wand effectively at that range and Neville could, and he pressed his wand directly under the Death Eater's chin and said "Stupefy" at a range of about 3 inches. The Death Eater was unconscious before he hit the floor. Neville stepped back, his shoulder was a heavy, numb weight that was beginning to become something more present. He looked around the hall. Luna had taken down 2, he'd taken 3. Ginny was handling a 4th with the efficient ferocity of someone running on adrenaline and fury. Hermione had reached Ron and gotten him upright. Harry was through the door. "We need to follow Harry," he said. His voice came out completely steady. He noted this as important but didn't stop to think about it. They moved through the Department of Mysteries in a formation that was more instinct than strategy, Harry somewhere ahead, the 5 of them together, following the sound of spells and the direction of running footsteps through chambers that kept shifting their character. The circular room with the doors, the room beyond that, the room beyond that. Luna was at his left elbow, consistent, and he was tracking her in his peripheral vision the way he'd always tracked her, the specific quality of her presence that he'd learned to read without looking, the small indicators of her state. They were in the brain room when it went wrong for Ron, really wrong, past the ankle wrong of a few minutes before. The tentacled thing from the tank caught him and wrapped around him, and Ron made a sound that Neville didn't want to hear again, and Hermione was there trying to fix it, and it was taking time. "I'll go ahead," Neville said. "Neville," Hermione started. "Harry's in the next room, I can hear it." He looked at her. "Get Ron sorted, follow when you can, I'll keep Harry in contact." He looked at Luna. Luna looked back at him. Her face was pale in the blue light of the brain room, but her eyes were completely steady. "I'm coming with you," she said. There was no discussion required. He'd known she'd say it, and he'd known before she said it that it was right. They went through the door. The time room was extraordinary, hourglasses of impossible scale, shifting light, time moving differently in different pockets of the space, the air thick with something that was almost visible if you looked sideways. They moved through it quickly, following the sound ahead. A Death Eater appeared from behind a rank of hourglasses, short, masked and fast, already casting. Luna moved. She did something Neville hadn't seen before, stepped directly sideways into the space between 2 hourglasses, used the space as cover, and cast from the cover in a direction the Death Eater couldn't track because it came from an angle they hadn't predicted. The spell caught the Death Eater's wand arm and Neville hit them with a stunning charm before they could recover, and that was that, quick and complete. "The logic of geography," Luna said. "If you understand the space better than your opponent, you own it," he finished. She looked at him, not the almost smile, the real one. "Yes," she said. They kept moving. The next chamber was the one Harry called the Death Chamber. He described it once to Neville: the high stone benches, the stone archway, the veil that moved when there was no wind and made sounds that were sometimes almost words. Neville had filed it away as one of Harry's genuine experiences, neither believing nor disbelieving, because Harry's genuine experiences tended to be extraordinary. He walked into it and understood immediately that it was all of those things and also completely real, and the archway with its tattered veil was the most unsettling thing he'd ever been in a room with. It pulled at him in a way he didn't want to investigate, not toward it, but toward the question of what it was, toward the sense that something on the other side of it was present, aware. Harry was in the room, and so were 5 Death Eaters. And so was Sirius Black, fighting with everything he had, fighting with the desperate energy of someone who has been trapped and is not going to let that define this moment, but outnumbered, and the Death Eaters were closing the geometry. Neville took in all of it in 2 seconds, the angles, the positions, the immediate threats in priority order. He looked at Luna. She had already done the same assessment. Their eyes met, the information transferred. He went left, she went right. The first Death Eater he hit didn't see him coming because he'd used the tiered stone seating as cover, moving low and fast along the base of the seating, coming up at a new angle, and the stunner hit them square in the back at full force, which was not the kind thing to do but was the correct thing to do, and he was already moving to the second target before the first hit the floor. Sirius freed a hand, and that hand had a wand, and that changed the geometry further. Luna, on the right side of the room, had her opponent confused, genuinely confused, moving wrong, casting wrong, their spells going to where she'd been rather than where she was, and she dispatched them with a spell Neville had seen her practicing in the DA but hadn't asked about, something very precise that hit the Death Eater's wand and destroyed it entirely, just the wand, perfectly targeted. She looked mildly pleased with herself. He'd started to think they might be all right. Then Bellatrix Lestrange arrived. She came through a side entrance. She'd been in another chamber doing something and had heard the sounds, and she came into the death chamber with the particular energy of someone who is at home in violence, who has made peace with the worst of themselves so completely that the worst has become the entirety. She was not the cartoonish madwoman that some people described. She was quick and smart, and she read the room in half a second and immediately targeted Harry, because she understood the same strategic geometry Neville had been practicing all year, and Harry was the most important piece. Harry ran, and Sirius ran after him toward Bellatrix, because that was who Sirius Black was, running toward danger when the danger was aimed at someone he loved. And Neville ran after both of them because what else do you do? The problem was Dolohov. One of the Death Eaters he hadn't fully dealt with, down but not unconscious, up on one elbow, cast something as Neville passed, and it hit him in the leg, not a stunner, something else, something that made his left leg stop cooperating with his brain. He went down hard on the stone steps, caught himself on both hands and pushed himself back up on one leg, because you push back up. He put weight on the bad leg. It held barely, with the specific determination of someone who has decided the alternative is worse. He kept moving. Harry reached Bellatrix. What followed was not a duel in the traditional sense. Bellatrix was playing, which made her more dangerous rather than less, and Harry was incandescent with something that was not quite rage, something purer and more terrible than rage, something that had his whole life in it, every year of the Dursleys and every year of Hogwarts and every moment of knowing Voldemort was real and coming and that nobody was listening. He was casting from that place, which gave his spells a power they didn't usually have and cost him precision he couldn't spare. Neville, on a bad leg, covered the distance to the archway room and cast a reducto at the stone support beam above the doorway that Bellatrix was using to shield herself, not to collapse it, precisely calibrated, exactly enough force to send stone fragments showering and force her to move out from behind it. She moved. Harry got a spell off. It hit her and she stumbled. Sirius was grinning, full open, the grin of someone who is exactly where they decided to be. And then Bellatrix cast something and it hit Sirius in the chest, and the light went out of his face, just like that, just in a moment, and he fell backward through the archway and the veil swallowed him and he was gone. Harry screamed. Neville was there before Harry could go through the archway after him. He was there because his leg was bad and he was slower than he'd been an hour ago, but the geometry was right, and he got a hand on Harry's arm before Harry could make the catastrophic decision his grief was driving him toward. "He's gone," Neville said, and his voice came out broken but present. "Harry, he's gone." Harry was not in the room for a moment. His face was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had gone dark, and Neville held his arm and said his name and stayed there, stayed physical and present, until Harry came back into his eyes. Bellatrix had run. The others arrived, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, Luna, filing into the death chamber with the particular faces of people who have been through something and are assessing what's on the other side of it. Ron's face was wrong, still shaken from the brain room. Ginny was limping. Hermione had blood on her cheek from somewhere. Luna looked at Neville, then at his leg, then at his face. "She ran," Harry said in a voice that was very flat and very dangerous. "We have to go after her." "Harry," Hermione started. "She killed Sirius." Harry looked at Hermione and what was on his face was not something arguable. "I'm going after her." "Then we go together," Neville said. Harry looked at him. Something moved in Harry's expression, something that recognized the quality of what Neville had just said and absorbed it. "You're hurt," Harry said. "I'm functional," Neville said. "And she heads wherever Voldemort is heading, which is up. We go together or we go after you." A beat. "Together," Harry said. The atrium was the final geography. They came out of the lifts into the vast golden hall, and Bellatrix was there, and she was screaming triumph, and then Voldemort was there, which was a sentence that contained more weight than any room could reasonably hold, and the space that had been the Ministry atrium became something else entirely. Dumbledore arrived. And then it was between Dumbledore and Voldemort, and it was enormous. It was vast and ancient and terrible and beautiful in the way that power clashing with power always is. And the six of them pressed against the far wall and watched something happen that none of them would be able to fully describe later, because you couldn't describe it any more than you could describe weather by looking at a photograph. What Neville noticed in the middle of all of it, while Dumbledore and Voldemort conducted their extraordinary and dangerous conversation in light and sound and magic, what he noticed was Luna. She had moved to stand directly beside him, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him, and her hand had found his as it had in the greenhouse, the same grip, present and deliberate and not dramatic about it. He held it. His leg hurt. His shoulder was a separate category of bad. The atrium smelled like ozone and old magic, and something burnt. The golden fountain was destroyed, the water black and still. Somewhere ahead, Voldemort and Dumbledore were matching forces in a way that had nothing to do with anything Neville could assist. He held Luna's hand and breathed and was present. Voldemort went. Fudge arrived, the Minister for Magic, flustered and pale, and his eyes took in the scene and his face went through several colors rapidly, and Neville watched the precise moment when Cornelius Fudge understood that he had been wrong, that the thing he'd spent a year calling a lie was standing in his own building in the Ministry's atrium and had just disappeared. The look on Fudge's face was complicated. Neville didn't feel sorry for him. He noted the look and filed it. The moment a man understands the cost of a convenient lie. Dumbledore was there. Dumbledore was speaking to Fudge with the particular precision of someone who has waited for an extremely long time for this specific conversation and is going to have it correctly. Neville heard fragments, the school, Harry, the terms of what came next. His leg gave out entirely. Not dramatically, he didn't fall, he just discovered that it wasn't going to hold him anymore, and he redistributed his weight to the wall, and Luna was there immediately, shoulder against his, taking some of it. "I'm all right," he said. "I know you are," she said, "but I'm here anyway." Madame Pomfrey arrived eventually through the Ministry emergency flu. Dumbledore had apparently summoned medical assistance without pausing his conversation with Fudge, which said something about his multitasking, and she moved through the six of them with the quick, comprehensive efficiency of someone who has been managing magical injuries for 4 decades. She looked at Neville's leg, did something that hurt considerably and then stopped hurting and said, 6 weeks of proper care if you're sensible. 3 days if I have anything to say about it. Thank you, he said. She moved on. He tested the leg, better, not healed but functional in a way it hadn't been. He looked at the atrium, at the wreckage, at his friends, at the fountain, at the magical residue still shimmering in the air where something extraordinary and terrible had happened. He looked at Harry. Harry was sitting on the floor against the far wall with his knees up and his face in his hands, and he was very still. The grief had arrived, not the first edge of it, not the shock, but the real weight of it settling in. Hermione was beside him, close, not talking. Ron was on his other side. Neville crossed the atrium to him and Luna came with him, and they sat, the 4 of them, then Ginny and eventually Luna too, on the floor of the Ministry atrium, and nobody said anything for a long time because there wasn't anything to say that was equal to what the silence was doing. What Neville felt sitting there was not triumph, it wasn't victory, it was something grittier and more honest, the specific exhaustion of having spent yourself completely in service of the right thing and the knowledge that the right thing had still cost something that couldn't be given back. He'd been prepared for danger. He had not been prepared for how much it would hurt to win. He felt Luna's shoulder against his. He leaned into it slightly. She leaned back. Neither of them said anything. The Ministry began to fill with people. Officials, auras, mediwizards. The scene took on the quality of an aftermath, which it was cleanup and assessment and the bureaucratic apparatus of something catastrophic being processed. Eventually a mediwizard came and insisted on getting Neville to a proper medical station, and he stood up, and he was steady, hurt, exhausted, profoundly altered in some way he hadn't found the language for yet, but steady. Luna stood up with him. He looked at her in the Ministry lights, harsh and official, nothing like the torch warmth of the castle corridors or the amber of the lightmoth jar, and she looked back at him, and she had a bruise forming along her left cheekbone that he hadn't registered before, and her hair was doing its independent thing, and she looked like someone who had been in a battle and had come through it in possession of herself, completely intact, everything she was carried forward into the aftermath without diminishment. "You were," he started. "Don't," she said gently. "Not here, not tonight." A pause. There will be time, he understood. There were things that needed more than a Ministry atrium at 1 in the morning to be said properly. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They walked together across the atrium toward the Mediwizard station, toward the Floo, toward whatever Hogwarts and tomorrow had arranged themselves into while they'd been here doing this. His leg hurt, his shoulder hurt. Something in the center of his chest felt altered, changed, like a bone that had broken and reset, not damaged, but different from what it had been. He was not the same person who had gotten on the Distral in the dark. He thought about this as they walked, with the careful attention he gave to things he was trying to understand accurately. He was still Neville Longbottom. Still the greenhouses, still the soil under his nails, still the boy who talked to his Mimbulus Mimbletonia and had nightmares about a hospital ward. All of that was present and true and not going anywhere. But he was also the person who had taken down 3 Death Eaters and held Harry Potter's arm at the edge of the archway and said he's gone in the way that means I'm here, and had meant every syllable of both. He was also the person who had fallen in love in a greenhouse at 2 in the morning over moondew ferns and Finnish vocabulary words, and had said I'm in this and meant it as the most serious thing he'd ever said. He was both and had always been capable of both, and the distance between the person he'd been and the person he was simply the distance of a year's worth of choosing differently, one deliberate choice at a time. Luna's hand found his as they crossed the final stretch of the atrium. He held it, he was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 6. The language of quiet things. The last week of term at Hogwarts had a different quality from any last week Neville could remember. Previous years had ended with the particular exhausted relief of an institution releasing its inhabitants, the accumulated noise of a year dispersing, trunks appearing in corridors, the gradual deconstruction of the routines that had held everything together. There had always been a lightness to it, however the year had gone. The promise of summer, the train home. This year the lightness wasn't there. Or rather, it was there in patches. He could see it in the younger students, 2nd and 3rd years who hadn't been to the ministry, whose year had been difficult in the abstract way of rules and surveillance and umbrage rather than the concrete way of stone floors and Death Eaters and a man falling through a veil. For them, Umbridge's removal and Dumbledore's return had been sufficient resolution. The year was over, summer was coming. For the 6 of them who had been in the Department of Mysteries, it was different. Harry was the most visible. He moved through the last week with the particular quality of someone carrying something that hadn't found its correct weight yet, the grief still settling, still shifting, not fixed in its place. He was not withdrawn exactly, not absent, but there was a membrane between him and ordinary things, a slight delay, a fraction of a second in which he was somewhere else before he came back. Neville watched him without making it obvious and left him space when he needed it, and showed up when he needed that instead, and didn't make a project of either. Hermione was throwing herself into end-of-year revision with an intensity that was her specific mechanism for processing anything too large to think about directly. Ron was staying close to Harry and doing it well, not asking questions, not offering solutions, just being physically present in the committed, uncomplicated way that was one of Ron's finest qualities and that he consistently undersold. Ginny had the look of someone who had crossed a line and was standing on the other side of it, changed by the crossing. She was more focused somehow, more herself, which was already quite a lot. Luna moved through the last week the way she moved through everything, with the particular calm that Neville had spent months learning to see under, the calm that was not detachment but its opposite, full and present beneath its surface. She attended her classes, ate her meals at the Ravenclaw table, was reading an upside-down Quibbler in the library on Tuesday morning when he found her there. He sat across from her. She lowered the magazine. They hadn't had the conversation yet, the one deferred in the ministry atrium. There had been the return to Hogwarts, which had been medically supervised and practically very busy, and then the school had produced its end-of-year machinery and they had been inside it, and the conversation had remained in the space between them where it had been put, patient and present, waiting. "How's your leg?" she said. "Better, Madame Pomfrey's remarkable." He'd been walking without favoring it since Thursday. "Your cheek." She touched the faded bruise with 2 fingers. "Almost gone." She looked at him. "You've been not saying something for 4 days. I've been finding the right moment. The library on Tuesday morning seems like a reasonable moment." He smiled. "It does." He looked at her across the table in the library light, morning light, grey and even, coming through the tall windows. She had her hair down and her radish earrings on, and she was looking at him with the full, complete attention that had been one of the first things he'd noticed about her and was still, 9 months later, one of the things that affected him most. "The night we went to the ministry," he said, "when everything was happening, there was a moment in the death chamber when I thought," he stopped, started again. "There was a moment when I thought the geometry was going wrong. When too many things were moving at once and I was calculating fast and the numbers weren't coming out right." She waited. "And I thought about you, not about protecting you. You were handling yourself better than most adults I've watched handle things. I thought about you specifically as a reason to get the geometry right." "As the reason?" He paused. "I want to say that clearly because I think you prefer clear language to comfortable ambiguity, and because I've spent most of my life being ambiguous by default and I'm done with it." Luna was very still. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been working up to that sentence since September and I've been almost saying it for weeks, and we were in a battle and a grief and an aftermath before I could get there properly, and now it's Tuesday morning in the library and I'm saying it properly. I love you. I want that to be a named, stated, plain fact between us." The library was quiet. In the stacks somewhere a book shifted on its shelf. Outside the windows, the Scottish sky was considering rain. Luna looked at him for a long moment. He watched her do it, watched her take it in, place it correctly, locate it in the accurate category. He saw the thing that happened under the serenity, the warming, the specific shift in her expression that he'd learned to read, and that was hers alone. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for some time. I was waiting for the right language." She paused. "Yours was better than mine, I think." What was yours going to be? She thought about it. "I was going to tell you that you're the first person who has made me feel ordinary in the best possible way. Not ordinary as in unremarkable, ordinary as in real, solid, present." She looked at her hands. "Most people I've loved have loved a version of me that they chose themselves. The strange one, the mad one, the convenient myth. You love the actual one. The one with a dead mother and a worry about her father and a Ravenclaw dormitory where she doesn't entirely belong. A breath. And that's not a small thing, Neville. That's the biggest thing I know how to receive." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same gesture as the greenhouse, the one that had become, he thought, their particular language for "I'm here and I mean it." She turned her hand over and held his. "The train," he said. She looked up. "The Hogwarts Express goes in 3 days. I want to sit with you on the train, together, not by accident. I want it to be the stated thing." She smiled, the real one, complete and unhurried, the one that changed her face completely and that he'd been storing up since October. "I'd like that very much," she said. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. They sat in the library for another hour, both of them doing work that needed doing, him finishing his last herbology documentation, her reading something dense and annotated in her precise, sideways handwriting, and it was the best kind of ordinary, the kind that had been earned and was all the better for it. The last DA meeting was not planned as a last DA meeting. Harry called it 2 days before the end of term in the 4th-floor storage room that had served them since the room of requirement was compromised, and when everyone arrived and found their seats in the cramped, low-ceilinged space, the mood was different from the working sessions. They all knew instinctively that this was something else, a different kind of gathering. Harry stood at the front and looked around the room at 20 faces and said without preamble, "Voldemort's back. The Ministry knows it now. Is out, someone named Scrimgeour is going to be minister apparently, which might be better or might just be differently bad. Dumbledore's back, and we have done," he stopped, seemed to be searching for the right scale, "we have done something real this year, all of us." Nobody spoke. "What we built here," Harry said, "was real. The magic was real. What you can do now that you couldn't in September, that's real. And what comes next is going to require all of it and probably more." A pause. "I don't know if we'll be able to keep meeting like this next year or what form it takes, but I know that what we started in the Hog's Head in October isn't finished. He exhaled, "I wanted to say that while we're all here." A silence. Then Neville said from his seat near the back, "We're all going to be better than Umbridge thought we were. We already are." He said it not as encouragement, not as a speech, just as a plain fact that the room needed to hear. She spent a year treating this school like it was something to be managed rather than something alive. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about all of us. He looked around the room. So was Voldemort, apparently. He sent 12 Death Eaters for 6 students and the numbers didn't come out the way he expected. The room was quiet for a beat. Then Seamus said, "Hear, hear," with feeling, and the room broke into something that was half laugh and half exhale, the release of something that had been held too tight for too long. Harry looked at Neville with an expression that was, it was gratitude, but under the gratitude was something more significant, the recognition of an equal, which was not something Harry gave easily because Harry was honest about what he saw, and what he saw was worth having. Neville nodded. They disbanded carefully and quietly as they always had, and in the corridor afterward Hermione fell into step with him and said without looking at him, "You've changed this year. I know, not just in DA, everything," she considered. "You think strategically now in a way you didn't before. You're not compensating anymore. You're just being good at things." "I stopped apologizing for taking up space," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Did Luna help with that?" He thought about the honest answer. "She made a space where I didn't need to apologize. That's different from her doing it for me." He paused. "I did it. She just the greenhouse at 2 in the morning, the letters, the way she talks to me like I'm worth talking to." He shrugged. "It becomes self-fulfilling eventually." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "She's very good," she said. "I don't think I've told her that." "Tell her." "I will." She paused. "And Neville, for what it's worth. What you did in the Department of Mysteries, what you've done all year." She stopped walking. "I was wrong about you in the early years. I put you in a category you didn't belong in, and I should have looked more carefully." He stopped too. "Hermione, you were 11. I should still have looked more carefully." He thought about this, about whether to deflect it, minimize it, give her the convenient exit from the discomfort. He decided not to. "Thank you for saying so," he said. "I appreciate it." She nodded, satisfied, and they walked on. The last night in the castle had the quality all last nights have, a mixture of completion and anticipation, the present tense feeling thinner as the future pressed against it. The common room was loud and warm, people playing games and finishing last correspondence and exchanging addresses for the summer with the earnest urgency of people who have been close enough to real danger to understand that next year is not guaranteed. Neville sat by the fire and wrote a letter to his grandmother. He told her about the year, not all of it. The letter was not long enough for all of it, but the essential parts, the DA, the Department of Mysteries, the leg. He told her about the correcting creeper documentation and that Professor Sprout had submitted it and it had been accepted and would be published in July with his name on it. He told her, and this required the most care, the most deliberate choosing of words, about Luna. He told Gran that he'd met someone who saw him clearly and didn't look away from what she saw. That was how he put it. He told her that Luna Lovegood was the daughter of Xenophilius Lovegood of the Quibbler, who had been one of the first publications to print the truth about Voldemort's return, and that Luna herself was someone he thought Gran would find clarifying, which was the word he'd settled on. He signed it, sealed it, and went up to bed. In the morning, the trunks were in the corridors and the castle was dismantling itself for summer, and the noise of it was loud and somewhat chaotic and entirely familiar. He carried his trunk down 4 flights of stairs, said goodbye to the portrait of fat lady who gave him a look of assessment and said, "You'll do, Longbottom," which was the highest praise that particular portrait offered, and went down to the main entrance. The carriages were waiting. He found Luna at the front of the line, standing beside one of the invisible Thestrals with her palm flat against its invisible flank, the gesture of someone greeting something they know. She was wearing her radish earrings and she had the quibbler tucked under her arm and her trunk was beside her, and when she saw him coming she didn't wave or call out, just watched him cross the distance between them with that particular expression, the one that was seeing him, the actual him, clearly and without revision. He reached her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "I've been saying hello to the carriage." "How's it doing?" She considered the question seriously. "It seems well." Slightly impatient, "It knows where it's going." He put his hand beside hers on the invisible flank of the Thestral, close but not touching, the warmth of the creature present and real, the solid invisible body of something that required a specific kind of knowledge to perceive. "Can you feel it?" she said. His hand was a centimeter from hers on the Thestral's side. He could feel the warmth, the shift of living muscle, the slow breath of the animal. He could feel all of it without seeing any of it. "Yes," he said, clearly. She turned to look at him. "You'll be able to see them next year," she said. "That's how it works. You feel them and then you see them, and once you see them you always do." A pause. "That's not just about Thestrals." He looked at her. "I know." They climbed into the carriage, together, deliberately, the stated thing, and the carriage moved, and around them the school emptied itself into the procession, the slow parade of a year's worth of life in transit towards summer, and the castle shrank behind them. On the Hogwarts Express they found a compartment, not one of the middle of the train compartments, not the ones near the noisy groups. One near the back where the light came through at a good angle and the rocking of the train was steady and the noise of the outside world was filtered into something ambient and distant. They settled in, Luna at the window, her legs tucked up, the quibbler open on her lap, Neville across from her, his bag stowed, his hands loose in his lap. Harry, Ron, Hermione and Ginny found them 20 minutes into the journey. Of course they did, because this was still all of them, and what had been built this year was not the kind of thing that reduced back down into smaller units just because the academic year was over. They came in with food from the trolley and the particular energy of people in transit, the specific permission that being between places gives to honesty. Ron sat down heavily and immediately opened a pumpkin pasty and said, "Right, so about next year," with the tone of someone who had been waiting the entire journey to have this conversation. "Ron," Hermione said, "What? We should talk about it. We have the entire summer to talk about it. Summer is for Quidditch and sleeping, now is for talking." Ron looked at Harry, who was by the window on the other side watching the Scottish landscape go by. Harry turned from the window. He looked not better, not fixed. Serious was not the kind of loss that fixed on a timeline, but present, more present than he'd been in the week since the ministry. Something had shifted in him overnight, some private resolution arrived at. "Next year," Harry said, "is going to be harder. Voldemort's not hiding anymore, the ministry's in chaos, Dumbledore's back, but I don't know how much he'll be at school." A pause. "I think next year the DA becomes something more serious. Not just practice sessions." He looked around the compartment. "I think we need to actually be ready." "We are ready," Ginny said with simple conviction. "More ready," Harry said. "All right, more ready." She met his eyes. "And we'll get there, same way we got here." She said it with the matter-of-factness of a person who has been through things and come out the other side still herself. Hermione was nodding, precise and determined. Ron was eating his pumpkin pasty, with an expression that communicated his complete commitment to both the conversation and the food simultaneously. Luna had lowered the quibbler, and was listening with the full, quiet attention she gave to things that mattered. Neville looked around the compartment at these people, these specific people. The exact combination that Luna had said on the night they flew to London was a good combination, and felt something that had no single clean name. Gratitude was part of it, love was a larger part, but underneath both of those was something that was purely and entirely his own, the quiet, enormous, certain knowledge of who he was and what he was here for and what he was willing to do, not fear, the opposite of fear. "I've been thinking," he said into a brief pause, "about what we know, what we actually know that's useful." He looked at Harry. "There are things we've learned this year about casting, about tactics, about how to think in a real situation that didn't exist in any of our heads in September, and the people in that DA room are all carrying those things now." He paused. Voldemort's organization works because it's made of people who believe they're on the winning side. The DA works because it's made of people who believe the right things are worth fighting for. A beat. That's not a small advantage. Harry looked at him across the compartment. No, Harry said, it's not. The train moved through the landscape, the highlands giving way to lower country, the light shifting with the geography, Scotland becoming England in the patient, incremental way of a long journey. The food diminished. The conversation moved through topics and came back to the center of things and moved away again, the way conversations do between people who trust each other. Somewhere around the third hour, Harry fell asleep against the window, which was the most normal thing Neville had seen him do in weeks, and Hermione smiled privately at her book, and Ron conducted a very quiet exploding snap game against himself that he appeared to be losing, and Ginny was writing something in a small notebook, her handwriting quick and decisive. Luna had gone back to the Quibbler. She was reading it right side up, which Neville had come to understand as a sign that she was reading for information rather than perspective shifting. Her feet were tucked under her and her hair was down and she looked completely herself, completely, specifically, irrevocably herself. He watched her read for a moment. She looked up without looking up. You're watching me. I am. Why? He considered the honest answer. Because I spent 4 years not noticing things that were right in front of me and I'm making up for lost time. She did look up then over the top of the magazine. 4 years. You've been at Hogwarts since our 3rd year. She lowered the Quibbler completely. You knew who I was before this year. I knew you existed. I didn't. He paused. I didn't know you yet. There's a difference, she said. Enormous difference. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I noticed you in our 4th year, in the library. You had 4 herbology texts open at once and you were cross-referencing them and you looked. She paused. You looked like someone who had found the one place in the world where the language made sense to them. I thought that person knows what it's like to have a subject that's actually a conversation rather than a transaction. He was quiet for a moment. You never said anything. You seemed very occupied. A pause. And I wasn't very good yet at saying things directly. I was still performing the strangeness rather than just being it. She looked at her magazine. This year was different. You were different and I was, she considered. I was tired of circling around the edges of things I wanted. What changed? She looked at him. You sat at the wrong table. He understood. The first morning of term, the Ravenclaw table, him picking up his plate and moving across the hall with the deliberate intent of someone who had decided to stop doing things by default. That was where she'd calculated the difference and arrived at a decision. Something about this, about the precision of it, that a single, small, intentional act had been the thing she'd been watching for, settled in him like the answer to a question he hadn't quite known he was asking. I had a dream, he said. At the beginning of the year, before term started, I dreamed I was in my greenhouse and someone was in the corner reading and I couldn't see their face. He paused. I knew when I woke up that it was significant, I just didn't know how yet. Luna was very still. I think now, he said, that the dream was ahead of the rest of me, knowing something I hadn't caught up with yet. He looked at her. The greenhouses are mine, my actual, deepest preference place in the world. And the dream put you in them before I'd thought to. He breathed. I don't know what to do with that except tell you. She set the Quibbler down on the seat beside her. Outside the window, the landscape was rolling and late afternoon golden, the light coming in at the low angle of early evening. In the carriage, their sleeping and reading friends were arranged around them in the easy postures of trust, and the train was a steady rhythm under everything, and it was a very good moment. Luna moved from her seat to sit beside him. It was unhurried and unapologetic, the way she did everything. She simply moved, settled in beside him close, and he adjusted to make room without making it a production, and she put her head against his shoulder the way you do when you've decided that's the right place for it. He did not say anything, neither did she. He thought about the year, about the train in September, the Dementor and the silver light and the chocolate frog. About sitting at the wrong table and the particular decision that had contained. About the greenhouse at 2 in the morning and the things you say to someone in the dark that you can't say in daylight. And then one day you can say them in daylight too, because you've stopped dividing the world into safe and unsafe. About his parents in their ward, hands quiet. About the dream where they didn't know him, and the slow understanding that loving them didn't require him to wait, that he could be fully, completely himself in this life and still carry them with him. Their bravery not a standard he'd failed to reach, but a thing he'd inherited and was spending, coin by coin, in his own way. About Malfoy in the greenhouse and Montague in the corridor and the death chamber floor, and his hand holding Harry's arm at the edge of the archway saying he's gone with the specificity of I'm here. About Professor Sprout saying publishable and him letting it land without explaining it away. About a Finnish word. About light moths and moondew ferns and the tips of someone's ears going pink in a library. About the Department of Mysteries, the cold geometry of it, the way everything had resolved into angles and timing, and the specific, immediate clarity of being fully present in a situation that required everything you had. Luna's breathing against his shoulder was even and warm. He was, he thought, very lucky, not in the comfortable, passive way, not the luck of someone things happen to. The active, earned kind, the luck that accrues when you pay attention and show up and make the deliberate choice one at a time to stop being small. Ron had fallen asleep too now, exploding snap cards scattered on his lap. Hermione was still reading, but her eyes moved up from the page every few minutes with a quality of contentment that she'd never show you if she knew you were watching. Ginny had closed her notebook and was looking out the window at the passing landscape. Ginny caught his eye and looked at Luna against his shoulder and looked back at him and smiled, just that, a clean, honest smile, nothing complicated, and looked back out the window. The train moved, the light changed. England in the late afternoon, all green and gold and ordinary. Neville, Luna said against his shoulder. Your grandmother, have you told her about me? Last night, in a letter. A pause. What did you tell her? He thought about the exact words. That you see me clearly and you don't look away from what you see. Luna was quiet for a moment. Her hand found his on the seat between them and held it, the grip warm and steady and completely itself. That's accurate, she said. I know. He turned his head slightly so he was speaking into her hair. She'll like you. She might not. She will. You're direct and you're honest and you don't say things you don't mean. Those are her qualities. She respects them in other people. He paused. She'll probably tell you that you're odd, though. She tells everyone something like that when she first meets them. It's not meant unkindly. I've been told I'm odd most of my life, Luna said. I find it restful rather than upsetting at this point. He laughed, a real one, quiet from somewhere genuine. She smiled against his shoulder. The train slowed. London was approaching in the specific way London approached, the landscape changing, the density increasing, the particular mixture of extraordinary and ordinary that characterized a city in which a significant percentage of the extraordinary was invisible to most of its inhabitants. Platform 9 3/4 was minutes away. Around them, people began to stir, Harry waking with the slightly confused quality of someone not sure how long they've been under, Ron's exploding snap card sliding off his lap, Hermione closing her book with the decisive click of someone finishing a chapter. Luna sat up from his shoulder, not quickly, not reluctantly, just the natural end of the position, the train requiring their attention. Summer, she said. Summer, he agreed. I'm going home to my father. He'll want to hear everything. She paused. He'll believe most of it and add several embellishments involving creatures that may or may not exist. And you'll let him? Of course, he's my father. She looked at him. You'll write, I'll write, and the correcting creeper paper comes out in July. I want you to read it before it's published. There's a secondary application I didn't include in the final draft and I want your opinion on whether I should have. Yes, she said, already interested, leaning forward slightly. What secondary application? Tell you in a letter it needs diagrams. She looked at him with an expression of pleased frustration that was new in his collection of her expressions and immediately valuable. You're deliberately withholding. I'm managing the correspondence so you have something to look forward to. She studied him. That's either very considerate or slightly manipulative. It's both, he said. I've been spending time with Slytherins. She laughed, a clear, genuine, completely unguarded laugh that he had not heard before in its full form. Not a smile, not a quiet amusement, but a real laugh, and it was extraordinary. And he understood in a complete and final way why people did things for the people they loved, not to create the laugh, but because the laugh existed and you'd been given access to it, which was an extraordinary privilege and deserved something in return. The train pulled into platform 9 3/4. Steam, noise, the particular organized chaos of 1,000 people arriving home, families pressing forward on the platform side, students pressing out from the train side, the controlled collision of those two movements producing something that looked like chaos and was actually the most efficient system available. They got down from the train onto the platform together, him, Luna, and behind them Harry and Ron and Hermione and Ginny, the 6 of them moving in the particular formation they'd fallen into by the end of the year, the configuration that the Ministry had tried to be afraid of and had been right to be. On the platform, the separations began. Ron's family, the Weasleys, enormous and warm and immediately loud, Mrs. Weasley gathering Harry in before she'd even said hello to her own children, which Harry submitted to with an expression that was complicated and real and full. Hermione's parents, quiet and a little formal and proud in a way they were still working out how to show. Luna's father appeared, wearing robes in a color that did not occur in nature, and Luna walked to him and he took her face in both hands and said something Neville couldn't hear, and she said something back. And then she leaned her forehead against his shoulder for a moment in a gesture that was purely private and entirely real. Neville's gran was near the back of the platform. She always was, never pushed forward with the crowd, waited at the edge with the patience of someone who had learned over a long life that things arrived when they arrived. She was wearing the vulture hat. She was watching him come toward her with an expression he was learning finally to read, not disappointment, had never been disappointment. It was the expression of someone hoping very hard, very quietly for something specific. He walked up to her. She looked at him, really looked, the full inventory, the way she always did, and her expression shifted through something and arrived somewhere different from where it had started. You look well, she said. I feel well. She put a hand on his face the way she hadn't done since he was very small, the same gesture Luna had received from her father a minute ago across the platform, brief and complete and saying everything the sentence couldn't. Your father, she said, would be extremely proud. He felt the sentence in his sternum, the same place everything real arrived. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said for the first time in the simple, certain present tense. She nodded once, satisfied. Then she looked past him down the platform with the focused attention of someone who has been told a thing in a letter and is now identifying the subject. "Is that her?" Gran said. He turned. Luna was standing with her father, but she was looking across the platform at him, those grey eyes clear across the noise and steam and movement, finding him with the same ease they always had. He raised a hand, she raised hers. His grandmother made a sound that was not quite a HMPH and not quite an approval, and was, knowing Gran, probably both. "She has unusual taste in earrings," Gran said. "Yes, direct eyes. Very. Xenophilius Lovegood's daughter. He's a lunatic, but he's honest." Gran paused. "Bring her to the house in August." He turned to look at Gran. She was watching him with the expression that had been hope before but wasn't anymore because hope had resolved into something more fixed. "I will," he said. She picked up her bag. "Good, now come on, the car's waiting and I've made a casserole." He picked up his trunk and followed his grandmother through the dispersing crowd, and he looked back once, not the look of someone leaving something behind, but the look of someone orienting, confirming the location of something important before a temporary distance. Luna was still watching him go. She lifted the quibbler once, a small, precise, entirely her gesture, and he laughed and turned forward again. Platform 9 3/4 thinned around him. The steam cleared. Through the barrier, London waited, ordinary, enormous, full of things that didn't know they were about to be asked to hold a war. Neville Longbottom walked through the barrier and into the summer with his head up and his hands steady and his wand in his pocket, and everything changed from how it had been, and nothing lost from what had mattered. He thought about September. About the Hogwarts Express going in the opposite direction, and a compartment, and a girl with a radish necklace who had looked at him like an interesting plant she hadn't catalogued yet. He thought about a patroness that was silver and formless and warm, produced in a moment of genuine certainty about something real. He thought about what that certainty had been made of that first time, the greenhouse, the soil, the belonging, the place that was his. He thought about the year of building it, of becoming it fully, of letting it be witnessed. He thought about all of it for exactly as long as the walk to Gran's car took, which was long enough, and then he was there, and the car was green and old and smelled like the same air freshener it had always smelled like, and Gran was telling him to put the trunk in without scratching anything, and the summer was beginning, and it was going to be the kind of summer that asks something serious of you. He was ready. He had always, it turned out, been ready. He just needed someone to sit at the wrong table for.